June 30th, 2025. Polar bear attacks airport runway crew in Alaska, injures 7. June 30th, 2025. Polar bear attacks airport runway crew in Alaska, injures 7. The Arctic wind howled across the barren tundra surrounding Utqiagvik Airport, formerly known as Barrow, carrying with it the scent of sea ice and the promise of another endless summer day in Alaska's northernmost community. At 11:47 p.m. on June 30th, 2025, the sun hung suspended in the pale sky, casting long shadows across the runway where 7 men worked methodically to replace a series of deteriorating approach lights that had been damaged during the previous winter's brutal storms. The temperature hovered at a deceptively mild 32 degrees Fahrenheit, but the wind chill brought it down to a bone-numbing 15 degrees below zero, forcing the crew to work in thick, insulated coveralls and heavy-duty gloves that made even the simplest tasks cumbersome and time-consuming. Daniel Scott, the 43-year-old maintenance supervisor for the North Slope Borough, had been working at Utqiagvik Airport for nearly 2 decades, long enough to have seen the gradual changes that climate change had brought to this remote corner of the world. Born and raised in Fairbanks, Daniel had moved north after completing his certification in airport operations and maintenance, drawn by the higher wages and the unique challenges that came with maintaining critical infrastructure in one of the most isolated and unforgiving environments on Earth. Standing 6 feet tall with graying brown hair and weathered features that spoke of countless hours spent working outdoors in sub-Arctic conditions, Daniel was known throughout the community as a meticulous professional who never cut corners when it came to safety protocols. His crew that evening consisted of 6 other men, each bringing their own expertise and experience to the complex task of runway light maintenance. Thomas Nakagrok, 38 years old and a member of the local Inupiaq community, had been working airport maintenance for 15 years and was Daniel's most trusted assistant supervisor. Thomas possessed an intimate knowledge of the local wildlife patterns that came from a lifetime of subsistence hunting and fishing, and he had often served as an unofficial early warning system for potential polar bear encounters in the area. His great-grandfather had been one of the last traditional polar bear hunters in the region before commercial whaling disrupted the traditional migration patterns, and Thomas carried that ancestral knowledge with him in his daily work. Marcus Rivera, 29 years old, had arrived in Utqiagvik only 8 months earlier from Phoenix, Arizona, seeking adventure and the opportunity to pay off student loans with the premium wages offered for Arctic work. Despite his relative inexperience with the harsh northern climate, Marcus had proven himself to be a quick learner and dedicated worker, though his colleagues sometimes worried about his tendency to underestimate the very real dangers that existed in their environment. Standing 5 feet 8 inches tall with dark hair and an optimistic demeanor that hadn't yet been worn down by the isolation and extreme weather, Marcus often provided a welcome source of levity during the long work shifts. James Kanguk, 41 years old, was another local man whose family had lived in the region for generations. His father had worked for the original distant early warning line radar installations during the Cold War, and James had grown up with stories about the importance of maintaining critical infrastructure in the face of both human and natural threats. A skilled electrician with specialized training in airport lighting systems, James was responsible for the technical aspects of their current repair project and took particular pride in ensuring that every light met or exceeded Federal Aviation Administration's specifications. Robert Chen, 35 years old, had moved to Alaska from Seattle 5 years earlier after his divorce, seeking a fresh start in a place where his past wouldn't follow him. A former software engineer who had grown tired of corporate life, Robert had retrained as an aircraft maintenance technician and found unexpected satisfaction in working with his hands rather than sitting behind a computer screen. His attention to detail and methodical approach made him invaluable for complex repair projects, though his colleagues sometimes noted that he seemed to use the isolation of their work environment as a way to avoid dealing with his personal problems. David Akivgak, 26 years old, was the youngest member of the crew and had grown up in Utqiagvik, graduating from high school just as the community was dealing with the accelerating effects of climate change on traditional ways of life. His grandfather had been a respected whaling captain, and David struggled with the tension between honoring his cultural heritage and adapting to the economic realities of modern Alaska. Working at the airport provided steady employment and benefits, but he often spoke of his desire to eventually return to more traditional activities if the changing climate ever stabilized enough to make them viable again. The seventh member of their crew was Peter Tungak, 52 years old and nearing retirement after a career that had spanned the transformation of Utqiagvik from a predominantly subsistence community to one increasingly dependent on government jobs and outside resources. Peter had worked through the transition from the old Barrow Airport to the modern facility, and his institutional memory made him an invaluable resource for understanding the unique challenges posed by their Arctic environment. He had survived 2 previous polar bear encounters during his career, experiences that had left him with a healthy respect for the intelligence and adaptability of these massive predators. The work they were conducting on the evening of June 30th was part of a comprehensive upgrade project that had been delayed multiple times due to weather conditions, supply chain issues, and the complex logistics of transporting specialized equipment to one of the most remote airports in North America. The approach lights they were replacing were critical safety equipment that guided aircraft during the limited periods of darkness that occurred during the Arctic summer, and their failure could potentially result in catastrophic accidents involving the cargo planes, passenger flights, and medical evacuation aircraft that provided Utqiagvik's only reliable connection to the outside world. The lights themselves were sophisticated pieces of equipment, each containing high-intensity LED arrays, specialized lenses designed to maintain visibility through blowing snow and ice crystals, and heating elements that prevented ice buildup during the brutal Arctic winters. The installation process required precise alignment and calibration, as even minor deviations could create dangerous visual illusions for pilots attempting to land in challenging conditions. Each light had to be individually tested using specialized equipment to ensure proper intensity, beam angle, and color temperature before the system could be certified for operational use. As the crew worked methodically through their checklist, the environment around them presented a stark reminder of their isolation and vulnerability. Utqiagvik Airport sits on a flat expanse of tundra, approximately 4 miles southwest of the community itself, with no natural barriers to provide protection from either the elements or the wildlife that called this region home. To the north, the Beaufort Sea stretched to the horizon, its ice-covered surface providing hunting grounds for the polar bears that had become increasingly common in the area as changing ice conditions forced them to spend more time on land rather than hunting seals from stable ice platforms. The airport's location had been chosen primarily for its flat terrain and relative protection from the worst coastal storms, but these advantages came with the significant disadvantage of placing critical infrastructure directly in the path of polar bear travel corridors that had been established over thousands of years. Recent studies by wildlife biologists had documented increasing numbers of polar bears using the airport area as a travel route between coastal hunting areas and inland denning sites, a pattern that had been disrupted by the changing ice conditions but was slowly adapting to new environmental realities. Daniel Scott was acutely aware of these risks, having attended multiple training sessions on polar bear safety protocols and having personally encountered bears on 3 previous occasions during his career. The most recent encounter had occurred just 14 months earlier, when a large male had wandered onto the runway during a routine maintenance operation, forcing the crew to take shelter in their vehicles until Alaska State Troopers could arrive with the specialized equipment needed to safely relocate the animal. That incident had resulted in updated safety protocols that required constant vigilance and immediate evacuation procedures whenever bears were spotted in the vicinity of the airport. The crew's safety equipment that evening included two-way radios for immediate communication with the airport control tower, air horns designed to startle and deter approaching bears, and pepper spray canisters specifically formulated for use against large predators. Their work vehicles, parked approximately 50 yards from their current work site, were equipped with emergency beacons and contained additional safety equipment including flares, first aid supplies, and emergency food and water supplies. Standard protocol required at least one crew member to maintain visual surveillance of the surrounding area at all times, though the nature of their current work made this challenging, as it required the full attention of multiple team members to safely handle the heavy lighting equipment. The weather conditions on the evening of June 30th were relatively favorable by Arctic standards, with visibility extending for several miles across the flat tundra and wind speeds that, while uncomfortable, did not pose a significant obstacle to their work. The temperature had been slowly dropping throughout the evening as the sun traced its lazy arc across the sky, but meteorological forecasts indicated that conditions would remain stable for the duration of their planned work shift. These seemingly benign conditions may have contributed to a subtle relaxation of the hypervigilance that was normally required when working in polar bear habitat, as the crew had grown accustomed to associating bear encounters with periods of poor visibility or extreme weather. Thomas Nakagrok later recalled that he had observed several ravens circling the area approximately an hour before the attack, behavior that his grandfather had taught him could sometimes indicate the presence of a large predator or carrion in the vicinity. However, ravens were common around the airport due to the food scraps and garbage associated with human activity, and their presence was not considered unusual enough to warrant heightened alert status. In hindsight, Thomas recognized that his traditional knowledge might have provided an earlier warning of the approaching danger, but the demands of their technical work had prevented him from giving proper attention to these subtle environmental cues. The polar bear that would soon change the lives of 7 men forever had been tracked by wildlife biologists as part of an ongoing research project studying the adaptation of polar bear populations to changing Arctic conditions. Known to researchers as bear number 347, this particular animal was an adult male estimated to be approximately 12 years old and weighing close to 1,200 pounds, making him one of the larger individuals in the local population. Equipped with a satellite tracking collar that had been placed during a research capture operation 18 months earlier, bear number 347 had demonstrated an unusual familiarity with human infrastructure and had been observed on multiple occasions investigating buildings, vehicles, and industrial equipment with a curiosity that concerned wildlife managers. The tracking data from bear number 347's collar would later reveal that he had been moving steadily toward the airport area for nearly 6 hours before the attack, following a route that took him along the coastline before turning inland toward the runway complex. His movement pattern suggested a deliberate approach rather than the random wandering that characterized most polar bear encounters with human infrastructure, though the motivations behind this behavior remained a subject of debate among wildlife experts. Some researchers theorized that the bear had learned to associate human activity with potential food sources, while others suggested that changing ice conditions had forced him to modify his traditional travel routes in ways that brought him into more frequent contact with human installations. The collar data indicated that bear number 347 had paused for approximately 45 minutes at a location roughly 2 miles from the airport, behavior that was consistent with a large predator surveying potential hunting grounds or assessing threats in his environment. During this period, the bear would have had an unobstructed view of the airport runway and would likely have observed the lights and movement associated with the maintenance crew's activities. The fact that he resumed his approach after this extended observation period suggested a level of calculated decision-making that distinguished this encounter from the typical opportunistic interactions between polar bears and human infrastructure. Wildlife cameras positioned along known bear travel corridors had captured images of bear number 347 approximately 3 hours before the attack, showing him moving with the purposeful gait of an animal on a mission rather than the more leisurely pace associated with foraging or exploration. The images revealed a massive animal in apparent good health, with a thick coat and substantial fat reserves that indicated successful hunting during the previous months. This physical condition was significant because well-fed bears were generally less likely to take the risks associated with approaching human activity, suggesting that factors other than hunger might have motivated his approach to the airport. As the maintenance crew continued their work on the approach lights, the routine nature of their tasks created a false sense of security that would prove to be tragically misplaced. Daniel Scott was focused on calibrating the beam angle of a newly installed light unit, a process that required precise adjustments and careful measurement to ensure compliance with federal aviation standards. The calibration equipment included a specialized photometer that needed to be positioned at exact distances and angles, requiring multiple crew members to coordinate their movements while handling delicate and expensive instruments. Thomas Nakagrok was operating the boom lift that positioned the calibration equipment, a complex piece of machinery that required constant attention to ensure safe operation on the uneven tundra surface. The lift's hydraulic systems were sensitive to the cold temperatures, and Thomas had to make frequent adjustments to maintain proper pressure and responsiveness. His position in the elevated cab provided an excellent vantage point for observing the surrounding area, but the noise of the hydraulic pumps and the demands of operating the lift made it difficult for him to maintain the level of environmental awareness that his traditional training had taught him was essential in polar bear country. Marcus Rivera and James Kanguk were working together to install the heavy base units for the lighting array, a task that required them to dig through the permanently frozen ground using specialized equipment designed to penetrate permafrost without damaging underground utilities or drainage systems. The permafrost in the area extended to depths of several hundred feet, making any excavation work extremely challenging and time-consuming. The noise generated by their pneumatic digging equipment created an acoustic environment that would have masked the approach of even a large animal moving across the frozen ground. Robert Chen was responsible for running the electrical connections between the individual light units and the main power distribution panel, work that required him to crawl through trenches that had been dug earlier in the week and had since accumulated several inches of blown snow and ice. His position below ground level significantly limited his field of vision and would have made it impossible for him to spot an approaching bear until it was already within striking distance of the work site. The electrical work itself required intense concentration to ensure proper connections and prevent short circuits that could damage expensive equipment or create safety hazards. David Akivgak was serving as the crew's tool and equipment manager, responsible for organizing and distributing the numerous specialized implements required for the complex installation process. His duties required him to move frequently between the work site and their equipment staging area, providing him with better mobility than his colleagues, but also creating a pattern of movement that would later prove to be tragically vulnerable to predator attack. The staging area was located approximately 30 yards from the main work site, a distance that had been chosen to keep valuable equipment away from the heavy machinery while maintaining reasonable access for the crew. Peter Tungak, as the senior crew member with the most experience in polar bear encounters, had been designated as the primary safety observer for the evening, responsible for maintaining awareness of environmental conditions and wildlife activity while his colleagues focused on their technical tasks. However, the complexity of the installation process had gradually drawn his attention to troubleshooting technical problems with the lighting equipment, causing him to spend increasing amounts of time focused on circuit diagrams and technical manuals rather than scanning the horizon for potential threats. The approach lights being installed were part of a precision approach path indicator system designed to provide pilots with visual guidance during landing approaches in challenging weather conditions. Each light had to be positioned with millimeter accuracy and aligned precisely with the runway center line to create the proper visual illusion of a stable glide path. The installation process required the use of survey-grade GPS equipment and laser alignment tools, adding layers of technical complexity that demanded the full attention of multiple crew members simultaneously. The work had progressed smoothly throughout the evening, with the crew successfully completing the installation of 4 light units and beginning work on the 5th in the sequence. Their efficiency was the result of months of preparation and planning, including detailed site surveys, equipment testing, and coordination with air traffic control to ensure that their activities did not interfere with flight operations. The project represented a significant investment in the safety and capability of Utqiagvik Airport, providing improved landing conditions that would benefit both routine cargo flights and emergency medical evacuation aircraft that served the isolated community. As midnight approached on what would technically become July 1st, 2025, the crew was approximately 3 hours into what was planned as a 6-hour work shift. The extended daylight of the Arctic summer made it possible to work around the clock during the brief window of favorable weather conditions, maximizing productivity while minimizing the number of days that equipment and personnel needed to be committed to the project. The scheduling had been carefully coordinated to avoid conflicts with the whale hunting season that was critically important to the local subsistence economy, demonstrating the complex balancing act required to maintain modern infrastructure in a traditional Arctic community. The first indication that something was wrong came not from any human observation, but from the sudden change in behavior of the ravens that had been circling the area throughout the evening. Thomas Nakagrok, whose elevated position in the boom lift provided the best overview of the worksite, noticed that the birds had suddenly become agitated and were calling with an intensity and frequency that seemed unusual even for these notoriously vocal creatures. His grandfather had taught him that ravens often served as early warning systems for other wildlife, and their behavior patterns could provide valuable information about conditions beyond human perception. However, the significance of the raven's behavior was not immediately apparent, as the crew had grown accustomed to wildlife activity around the airport and had learned to distinguish between normal environmental noise and genuine warning signs. The sound of their equipment, combined with the constant Arctic wind, created an acoustic environment that made it difficult to distinguish between different types of animal vocalizations or to determine the direction from which sounds were originating. These factors would later be identified as contributing elements in the failure to detect the approaching bear until it was too late to implement effective defensive measures. Bear number 347 had approached the worksite using a route that took advantage of natural ground features to minimize his visibility while providing optimal observation of human activity. The flat tundra surrounding the airport was not as featureless as it appeared from a distance, containing subtle ridges, depressions, and variations in vegetation that an experienced predator could use for concealment. The bear had demonstrated sophisticated tactical awareness by approaching from the downwind direction, ensuring that human scent would not alert him to changes in the crew's behavior or activity levels, while preventing his own scent from reaching the worksite prematurely. The satellite tracking data would later show that the bear had paused multiple times during his final approach, spending several minutes at each position, apparently observing the maintenance crew and assessing the tactical situation before continuing his advance. This pattern of movement was consistent with hunting behavior observed in polar bears stalking seals, suggesting that bear number 347 had categorized the human workers as potential prey rather than simply objects of curiosity. The calculated nature of his approach indicated a level of predatory intelligence that challenged assumptions about polar bear behavior in encounters with human infrastructure. Wildlife experts would later note that the bear's approach route brought him to within approximately 200 yards of the worksite before he would have been visible to any of the crew members, even those specifically assigned to maintain environmental awareness. The combination of ground features, equipment placement, and the crew's focused attention on technical tasks created a situation where a large predator could approach undetected despite the relatively open terrain and generally favorable visibility conditions. This tactical disadvantage was compounded by the noise generated by the crew's equipment, which would have masked any sounds associated with the bear's movement across the frozen ground. At 11:52 p.m., David Arkivgak was returning from the equipment staging area, carrying a specialized torque wrench needed for the installation of the next light unit when he became the first human to observe bear number 347. The bear had emerged from a shallow depression approximately 150 yards from the work site and was moving toward them with a purposeful gait that David immediately recognized as predatory behavior. His grandfather had been a respected polar bear hunter, and David had grown up with stories about the importance of recognizing the subtle signs that distinguished a curious bear from a hunting bear. David's initial response was to freeze in place, a reaction that probably saved his life by avoiding the sudden movement that might have triggered an immediate charge. The bear was moving at a steady pace that covered ground quickly, but did not yet represent the full-speed charge associated with an imminent attack. David estimated the distance at approximately 140 yards and closing, giving him perhaps 2 to 3 minutes before the bear would reach the work site. His training in polar bear safety protocols had emphasized the importance of early detection and immediate notification of other personnel, as successful defensive measures required coordinated group action rather than individual responses. David's first action was to activate his two-way radio and broadcast an emergency alert to his colleagues using the code phrase "White Bear" that had been established to indicate an immediate polar bear threat. The radio transmission was clear and received by all members of the crew, but the response was initially hampered by confusion about the bear's location and the appropriate defensive measures to implement. Several crew members initially assumed that the sighting was at a safe distance and continued their work while beginning a more leisurely movement toward their vehicles, a response that would prove to be tragically inadequate given the speed with which the situation was about to deteriorate. Daniel Scott, as the crew supervisor, immediately took charge of the emergency response and began implementing the polar bear encounter protocols that had been drilled multiple times during safety training sessions. His first priority was to account for all 7 crew members and ensure that everyone was aware of the threat and moving toward the designated safe zone near their vehicles. However, the crew was spread across an area of approximately 100 yards, with several members engaged in tasks that required time to safely shut down, before they could abandon their positions. Thomas Nakagrok, operating the boom lift, required several minutes to safely lower the platform and shut down the hydraulic systems, processes that could not be rushed without creating additional safety hazards for personnel on the ground. The boom lift represented both a potential refuge due to its height and a potential trap if the hydraulic systems were damaged, or if the bear demonstrated the climbing ability that had been observed in some polar bear encounters with industrial equipment. Thomas made the decision to continue operating the lift to provide an elevated observation post while his colleagues moved to safer positions, a choice that would prove to be critically important in the coming minutes. Marcus Rivera and James Kanguk were working in the excavated trenches when the bear alert was broadcast, positions that provided some concealment but also limited their mobility and escape options. The trenches were approximately 4 feet deep and had been dug with nearly vertical sides to minimize the area of disturbed permafrost, creating what amounted to linear pits that would be difficult to exit quickly while wearing heavy winter work gear. Both men began moving toward the nearest exit point, but their progress was slowed by the tools and equipment that filled the narrow trenches and by the need to avoid damaging expensive electrical components in their haste to reach safety. Robert Chen, who had been working inside one of the equipment enclosures, was initially unaware of the bear alert due to the metal construction of the building, which blocked radio transmissions. His first indication of the emergency came when he observed his colleagues moving rapidly toward their vehicles, behavior that seemed inconsistent with normal work procedures. By the time he had exited the enclosure and activated his radio to request clarification, the bear had closed to within 100 yards of the worksite and was clearly visible to anyone with an unobstructed view of the surrounding area. Peter Tungak, whose experience with previous bear encounters had taught him to take such threats seriously, immediately began gathering the crew's emergency equipment, including air horns, flares, and pepper spray canisters. His actions were based on established protocols that emphasized the use of deterrent measures to discourage bear approaches while maintaining escape routes to vehicle-based refuges. However, the distance between the work site and their vehicles, combined with the bear's rate of approach, created a tactical situation that would challenge even well-rehearsed emergency procedures. The crew's vehicles were parked in a designated staging area approximately 60 yards from the work site, a distance that had been chosen to provide reasonable access while keeping the vehicles clear of heavy equipment operations. Under normal circumstances, this distance could be covered in less than a minute, but the crew's heavy winter gear, the uneven tundra surface, and the presence of scattered tools and equipment created obstacles that would significantly slow their movement. Additionally, not all of the vehicles were equipped with adequate protection against a determined polar bear attack, as standard pickup trucks and utility vehicles offered limited security against an animal capable of breaking through heavy wooden doors and metal siding. As the crew began their emergency evacuation, bear number 347 seemed to recognize the change in human behavior and responded by increasing his own pace of approach. Wildlife experts would later note that this behavioral adaptation demonstrated the sophisticated threat assessment capabilities of polar bears, as the animal had apparently recognized that his opportunity to approach undetected was diminishing and had adjusted his tactics accordingly. The bear's change from a steady approach to an accelerated advance was a clear indication that he had committed to an attack and was no longer simply investigating human activity. Thomas Nakagrok, from his elevated position in the boom lift, was able to observe both the bear's approach and his colleagues' evacuation efforts, providing him with the tactical overview necessary to coordinate defensive measures. His radio communications became a critical lifeline for crew members whose view of the situation was limited by equipment, terrain features, or their positions within excavated areas. Thomas's observations indicated that the bear was angling his approach to intercept the crew's movement toward their vehicles, demonstrating a level of tactical intelligence that suggested experience with hunting mobile prey. The bear's estimated weight of 1,200 pounds and his apparent good physical condition meant that he could sustain speeds of up to 35 miles per hour for short distances, making it unlikely that any crew member could outrun him across open ground. This reality had been emphasized repeatedly during safety training, with protocols stressing the importance of group defensive measures and the use of deterrent devices rather than attempting to escape through superior speed. However, the practical implementation of these protocols proved to be significantly more challenging than training exercises had suggested, particularly when crew members were scattered across a large area and equipped with tools rather than defensive weapons. David Akivgak, who had maintained visual contact with the bear since his initial sighting, observed that the animal was displaying several behaviors associated with predatory rather than defensive actions. The bear's head was held low, his ears were positioned forward, and his movement was characterized by the smooth, purposeful gait of a hunting animal rather than the more erratic movement pattern associated with a curious or startled bear. These observations were consistent with wildlife behavior guides that emphasized the importance of recognizing the difference between bears that were merely investigating human activity and those that had made a conscious decision to attack. The crew's defensive equipment included several items specifically designed for polar bear encounters, but the effectiveness of these tools depended on proper timing and coordinated use rather than individual deployment. Air horns were most effective when used in groups to create overwhelming noise that could startle and confuse a charging bear, while pepper spray required close-range deployment and favorable wind conditions to be effective against such a large animal. Flares could serve both as visual deterrents and as potential weapons if deployed correctly, but they required precise timing and could create additional hazards if used improperly in the presence of fuel and other flammable materials. As the distance between bear number 347 and the worksite continued to diminish, the crew's evacuation efforts became increasingly frantic. Marcus Rivera and James Kanguk had successfully exited the trenches, but were still approximately 40 yards from the nearest vehicle when the bear closed to within 80 yards of their position. Their heavy winter gear, designed to protect against Arctic temperatures, significantly impeded their movement across the uneven tundra surface and made it difficult to maintain balance while carrying essential equipment and personal items. Robert Chen, who had been the last to become aware of the emergency, was approximately 50 yards from the vehicle staging area when he observed the bear for the first time. His initial reaction was one of disbelief at the sheer size of the animal, as bear number 347 represented the largest polar bear that any of the crew members had ever encountered in person. The bear's massive frame and powerful musculature were clearly visible even at a distance, providing a sobering reminder of the physical mismatch between humans and one of the Arctic's most formidable predators. Peter Tungak had successfully gathered most of the crew's emergency equipment and was moving toward the vehicles when he made the tactical decision to deploy the first of their deterrent measures. His experience with previous bear encounters had taught him that early intervention was often more effective than waiting until the animal was at close range, as bears that had fully committed to an attack were less likely to be deterred by noise or visual displays. Peter activated 2 air horns simultaneously, creating a cacophonous sound that carried clearly across the flat tundra and was intended to startle the bear and disrupt his approach. The air horn deployment had an immediate but unexpected effect on bear number 347's behavior. Rather than being startled or deterred by the sound, the bear seemed to interpret the noise as a challenge or threat and responded by accelerating his approach to what observers estimated was nearly his maximum running speed. Wildlife experts would later note that this reaction was consistent with the behavior of polar bears that had become habituated to human activity and no longer viewed loud noises as sufficient reason to avoid contact with humans. The bear's response transformed what had been a manageable emergency situation into an immediate life-threatening crisis for the entire crew. Daniel Scott, observing the failure of the air horn deterrent, made the critical decision to abandon the planned evacuation to vehicles and instead implement emergency dispersal protocols designed to minimize casualties when defensive measures proved ineffective. The dispersal strategy was based on the principle that polar bears, like most predators, typically focused on single targets rather than attempting to attack multiple individuals simultaneously. By spreading out across the available terrain, the crew could potentially limit the attack to one or two individuals while allowing others to reach safety or implement rescue measures. However, the implementation of dispersal protocols required clear communication and coordinated movement, both of which became extremely difficult as the bear closed to within 60 yards of the worksite. The noise of the animal's movement across the frozen ground, combined with the continued sound of air horns and the crew's shouted communications, created an acoustic environment that made it nearly impossible to hear radio transmissions or coordinate defensive actions. Additionally, the crew's heavy winter gear and the scattered equipment across the worksite created obstacles that prevented rapid movement and made it difficult to maintain visual contact with both the bear and other crew members. Thomas Nakagrok, still positioned in the boom lift, found himself in the unique position of being able to observe the entire situation from an elevated perspective while potentially being out of reach of the bear's initial attack. His radio communications became increasingly urgent as he provided real-time updates on the bear's position and movement, information that was critical for crew members whose view of the situation was limited by terrain features and equipment. However, Thomas also faced the difficult decision of whether to remain in the lift as the observer and communications coordinator, or to lower the platform and attempt to join his colleagues in their evacuation efforts. The boom lift represented both an advantage and a potential liability in the developing crisis. While its height might provide protection from a ground-based attack, the machine's hydraulic systems and electrical components could potentially be damaged by a determined bear, trapping Thomas in an elevated position without means of escape. Additionally, the lift's position made it impossible for Thomas to provide direct assistance to colleagues who might be attacked, limiting his role to that of an observer and communications coordinator rather than an active participant in defensive measures. Bear number 3, 47's acceleration toward the worksite demonstrated the remarkable speed and agility that made polar bears such effective predators despite their massive size. Wildlife biologists estimated that the bear was covering ground at approximately 30 miles per hour, a pace that would bring him into contact with the scattered crew members within less than 2 minutes. The bear's approach route was angled to intercept the crew's movement toward their vehicles, indicating a level of tactical awareness that suggested experience with hunting mobile prey across open terrain. David Akivgak, who had maintained the longest visual contact with the approaching bear, made the decision to implement an individual survival strategy based on his knowledge of traditional Inupiaq hunting techniques. Rather than continuing toward the vehicles with his colleagues, David began moving at an angle that would take him toward a cluster of equipment containers that might provide some degree of protection or concealment. His decision was based on the calculation that the bear would likely focus on the larger group of crew members moving toward the vehicles, potentially allowing him to avoid the initial attack and position himself to provide assistance or implement rescue measures. Marcus Rivera and James Kanguk, running side by side toward the vehicle staging area, represented the largest group of potential targets for the approaching bear. Their movement was hampered by their heavy winter gear and the need to traverse uneven tundra while carrying essential personal equipment, including radios and emergency supplies. The distance to their nearest vehicle had diminished to approximately 30 yards, but the bear's rate of approach made it increasingly unlikely that they would reach safety before being overtaken by the massive predator. Robert Chen had altered his evacuation route to angle toward a maintenance shed that was positioned between the worksite and the vehicle staging area, calculating that the building might provide better protection than the vehicles themselves. The shed was constructed of reinforced metal siding designed to withstand Arctic weather conditions, and its single door could potentially be barricaded from the inside if he could reach it before the bear. However, the building was not specifically designed to provide protection against large predators, and its effectiveness would depend largely on the bear's level of determination and problem-solving ability. Peter Tungak continued to deploy deterrent measures as he moved toward the vehicles, using flares and additional air horn blasts in an attempt to confuse or startle the charging bear. His actions were based on emergency protocols that emphasized the importance of maintaining defensive pressure even when primary deterrents had proven ineffective, as multiple stimuli might succeed where individual measures had failed. However, the bear's continued acceleration suggested that he had committed fully to the attack and was unlikely to be deterred by additional noise or visual displays. The crew's radio communications during these critical minutes provided an audio record of the developing crisis that would later be analyzed by wildlife experts, emergency response specialists, and safety investigators. The transmissions revealed the difficulty of implementing coordinated defensive measures under extreme stress, as crew members struggled to communicate their positions, intentions, and observations while simultaneously focusing on their individual survival. The radio traffic also documented the rapid deterioration of the tactical situation, as it became clear that the bear would not be deterred by standard safety protocols. Thomas Nakagrok's elevated position allowed him to observe that bear number 347 was approaching the worksite with a level of focus and determination that distinguished this encounter from typical curiosity-driven interactions between polar bears and human infrastructure. The bear's body language, movement pattern, and apparent disregard for deterrent measures all indicated that he had categorized the crew members as prey rather than simply objects of investigation. This assessment was communicated to his colleagues via radio, providing them with critical information about the nature of the threat they were facing. As the bear closed to within 40 yards of the nearest crew members, the situation transitioned from an emergency evacuation to an active predator attack. The crew's scattered positions and varied evacuation routes had created multiple potential target opportunities for the bear, but his approach pattern suggested that he was focusing primarily on Marcus Rivera and James Kanguk, who represented the largest group of individuals moving across open ground. The bear's tactical decision to pursue these targets would prove to have devastating consequences for both men and would set in motion a chain of events that would traumatize the entire crew and the broader Utqiagvik community. Wildlife experts would later note that polar bears, unlike many other large predators, often demonstrated remarkable persistence in pursuing selected prey, sometimes continuing attacks even when faced with significant resistance or deterrent measures. This behavioral characteristic was thought to be related to the harsh Arctic environment, where successful hunting opportunities were relatively rare and the failure to capitalize on available prey could result in starvation. Bear number 347's commitment to the attack, despite the noise and activity generated by the crew's defensive measures, was consistent with this pattern of behavior and indicated that the situation was unlikely to be resolved through deterrent measures alone. The moment that would forever change the lives of 7 men and send shockwaves through the Arctic aviation community occurred at exactly 11:54 p.m. on June 30th, 2025, when bear number 347 made contact with the first human victim. Marcus Rivera, who had been running toward the vehicle staging area alongside James Kanguk, stumbled on a piece of scattered equipment and fell forward onto the frozen tundra just as the massive predator reached their position. The fall likely saved Marcus from the bear's initial charge, which was aimed at his upper body and head, but it also left him in an extremely vulnerable position as the 1,200-pound animal attempted to adjust to the changed tactical situation. Bear number 347's initial attack was characterized by the explosive power and speed that made polar bears among the most dangerous predators in the world. The bear's massive front paws, armed with claws that measured up to 4 inches in length, struck Marcus's prone form with tremendous force, immediately causing severe trauma to his back, shoulders, and arms. The impact was audible to crew members positioned more than 50 yards away, a sickening combination of tearing fabric, breaking equipment, and human screams that would haunt the survivors for months afterward. James Kanguk, who had been running directly beside Marcus when the attack began, found himself in the impossible position of being within arm's reach of a massive predator that was actively mauling his colleague. His first instinct was to attempt to help Marcus, but the bear's size and aggressive behavior made any direct intervention extremely dangerous. James began shouting and waving his arms in an attempt to distract the bear, actions that were consistent with emergency protocols, but that also drew the animal's attention to him as a potential secondary target. The bear's attack on Marcus Rivera demonstrated the devastating efficiency of a polar bear's hunting behavior when applied to human prey. Within seconds of making contact, the bear had inflicted multiple severe injuries, including deep lacerations to Marcus's arms and shoulders, crushing injuries to his ribs and back, and damage to his winter clothing that exposed him to the deadly Arctic temperatures. Marcus's screams were clearly audible across the worksite, providing a horrifying soundtrack to the developing crisis and spurring his colleagues to desperate action. Thomas Nakagrok, observing the attack from his elevated position in the boom lift, began using the machine's hydraulic systems to create additional noise and movement in an attempt to distract the bear from his assault on Marcus. The boom lift's diesel engine and hydraulic pumps generated significant mechanical noise that might potentially confuse or startle the predator, while the movement of the elevated platform created visual stimuli that could draw the bear's attention away from his victim. However, these actions also put Thomas at risk of becoming a target if the bear decided to investigate the source of the mechanical activity. Daniel Scott, who had reached the vehicle staging area along with Peter Tungak, made the critical decision to attempt a rescue operation rather than seeking safety inside one of the vehicles. Armed with pepper spray and emergency flares, Daniel began moving back toward the attack site in an attempt to drive off the bear and provide assistance to Marcus. His actions violated standard safety protocols that emphasized personal survival over rescue attempts. But Daniel's 20 years of experience working in Arctic conditions had taught him that immediate action was often the difference between life and death in emergency situations. Peter Tungak supported Daniel's rescue attempt by creating a coordinated deterrent display using multiple air horns, flares, and shouting designed to overwhelm the bear's senses and force him to retreat from his victim. The deterrent strategy was based on established protocols for dealing with polar bear attacks, but its effectiveness against such a large and apparently determined predator remained uncertain. Peter's experience with previous bear encounters had taught him that successful interventions required sustained pressure rather than single deterrent actions. But the current situation tested the limits of any established defensive strategy. Robert Chen, who had successfully reached the maintenance shed, found himself in the position of being able to observe the attack while remaining relatively safe from immediate danger. His location provided him with a clear view of the crisis, but also presented him with the agonizing decision of whether to remain in safety or attempt to assist in the rescue of his colleague. The shed's construction would provide protection from the bear, but it also isolated him from radio communications and limited his ability to coordinate with other crew members who were attempting rescue operations. David Akivgak, who had positioned himself among the equipment containers, began implementing improvised deterrent measures using the tools and materials available at his location. His actions included activating vehicle alarms, throwing tools and equipment to create noise and confusion, and using a portable generator to create additional mechanical sounds that might distract the bear. David's knowledge of traditional hunting techniques provided him with insights into polar bear behavior that could potentially be exploited to disrupt the animal's focus on Marcus. But the effectiveness of these measures remained uncertain given the bear's apparent commitment to the attack. The attack on Marcus Rivera continued for what witnesses estimated was approximately 3 to 4 minutes, during which time the bear inflicted devastating injuries that would require immediate medical intervention to prevent death from blood loss and exposure. The bear's behavior during this period was consistent with typical polar bear predation patterns, involving repeated biting and clawing actions designed to disable prey and facilitate consumption. The fact that Marcus remained conscious and vocal throughout much of the attack provided both hope for his survival and additional trauma for his colleagues who were witnessing the assault. James Kanguk's attempts to distract the bear from Marcus eventually succeeded in drawing the animal's attention, but the result was to make him the target of a secondary attack that proved to be equally devastating. As bear number 347 turned away from Marcus to investigate the source of James's shouting, he launched himself at the second crew member with the same explosive power that had characterized his initial assault. James attempted to retreat, but was overtaken within a few steps, becoming the second victim of what was rapidly escalating into a mass casualty incident. The bear's attack on James Kanguk was witnessed by multiple crew members and provided them with a horrifying demonstration of the animal's power and aggression. The initial contact knocked James to the ground and immediately caused severe injuries to his legs and lower torso, injuries that would later require multiple surgical procedures to repair and would leave him with permanent disabilities. James's screams joined those of Marcus Rivera in creating an acoustic nightmare that would traumatize the surviving crew members and serve as a constant reminder of their colleagues' suffering. Daniel Scott's rescue attempt brought him to within approximately 20 yards of the bear and his victims, close enough to deploy pepper spray, but also close enough to become a potential target for the animal's aggression. His approach was coordinated with Peter Tungak's continued use of deterrent measures, creating a multi-pronged strategy designed to overwhelm the bear's senses and force him to retreat. However, the bear's continued focus on James Kanguk suggested that the animal was not easily deterred once he had committed to an attack, raising questions about the effectiveness of standard defensive protocols against such a large and determined predator. The pepper spray deployment by Daniel Scott represented one of the crew's most promising defensive options, as chemical deterrents had proven effective in some previous polar bear encounters. However, the effectiveness of pepper spray against polar bears depended heavily on factors including wind direction, range, and the animal's level of aggression. The Arctic wind conditions on the evening of June 30th were variable and included gusts that could potentially redirect the spray away from the intended target or even back toward the human deploying the deterrent. Thomas Nakagrok's continued operation of the boom lift created an increasingly complex tactical situation as the bear demonstrated awareness of multiple threats and stimuli in his environment. The boom lift's mechanical noise and movement had initially seemed to provide distraction from the attack, but the bear's intelligence and adaptability became apparent as he began to assess and prioritize the various threats surrounding him. Wildlife experts would later note that polar bears possessed sophisticated threat assessment capabilities that allowed them to distinguish between immediate dangers and background disturbances, a cognitive ability that complicated human defensive strategies. The radio communications during the attack provided a real-time record of the crew's desperate attempts to coordinate rescue operations while dealing with the psychological trauma of witnessing their colleagues being mauled by a massive predator. The transmissions revealed the difficulty of maintaining clear communication under extreme stress, as crew members struggled to provide accurate position reports and tactical assessments, while simultaneously implementing defensive measures and evacuation procedures. Peter Tungak's deployment of emergency flares created additional visual and auditory stimuli that were intended to confuse and deter the bear, but the effectiveness of these measures remained questionable, given the animal's apparent focus on his human victims. The flares did succeed in creating dramatic lighting effects that improved visibility for crew members attempting to assess the tactical situation. But they also created additional hazards, including the risk of igniting fuel or other flammable materials that were present at the work site. As the attack continued, it became increasingly apparent that the crew's standard safety protocols and equipment were inadequate for dealing with such a large and aggressive predator. The bear's size, strength, and apparent disregard for deterrent measures challenged fundamental assumptions about the effectiveness of established polar bear safety procedures, particularly when dealing with animals that had become habituated to human activity and were no longer afraid of typical deterrent measures. The injuries sustained by Marcus Rivera during the bear's initial attack were severe enough to require immediate medical intervention, but the ongoing nature of the assault made it impossible for his colleagues to provide first aid or evacuate him to safety. Marcus's condition deteriorated rapidly due to blood loss and exposure to Arctic temperatures through his damaged winter clothing, creating a medical emergency that compounded the tactical crisis facing the crew. His weakening voice and reduced movement indicated that he was losing consciousness, adding urgency to the rescue attempts being coordinated by Daniel Scott and Peter Tungak. James Kanguk's injuries were similarly severe and included damage to major blood vessels in his legs that created a life-threatening hemorrhage. His position on the ground near the attacking bear made it impossible for other crew members to reach him with first aid supplies, while the bear's continued aggression prevented any attempt to evacuate him to safety. The combination of severe trauma and exposure to Arctic conditions created a medical situation that would require immediate helicopter evacuation and surgical intervention if James was to survive his injuries. The bear's behavior during the extended attack demonstrated several characteristics that distinguished this encounter from typical polar bear interactions with humans. Bear number 347 showed remarkable persistence in his assault on the two victims, continuing the attack despite the noise, movement, and chemical deterrents deployed by the other crew members. This level of determination suggested that the bear had fully committed to treating the humans as prey rather than simply defending territory or investigating curious objects, a categorization that made him extremely dangerous to all crew members in the vicinity. Wildlife experts would later analyze the attack and note that bear number 347's behavior was consistent with predatory patterns observed in polar bears hunting seals and other marine mammals. The bear's use of his massive front paws to disable victims, followed by biting attacks aimed at vital areas, demonstrated the same techniques that made polar bears such effective hunters in their natural environment. The application of these techniques to human victims resulted in injuries that were far more severe than those typically associated with defensive bear encounters, highlighting the importance of distinguishing between different types of bear behavior when developing safety protocols. David Arkivgak's improvised deterrent efforts using available equipment and materials represented a creative response to the crisis. But the effectiveness of these measures was limited by the bear's apparent focus on his victims and his disregard for background noise and activity. David's position among the equipment containers provided him with access to a variety of tools and materials that could potentially be used as deterrents or weapons, but the bear's size and aggression made direct confrontation extremely dangerous, even for someone with traditional knowledge of polar bear behavior. The crew's scattered positions across the work site had initially been intended to minimize casualties through dispersal, but the bear's persistence and tactical intelligence made it difficult to implement coordinated defensive measures. The distance between crew members made it challenging to coordinate the timing of deterrent deployments, while the Arctic wind conditions interfered with radio communications and made it difficult to hear shouted instructions or warnings. These factors combined to create a situation where individual crew members were forced to make critical decisions about rescue attempts and defensive measures without full knowledge of the tactical situation or the actions being taken by their colleagues. Robert Chen's position in the maintenance shed provided him with relative safety, but also isolated him from the developing rescue operation. His location offered clear observation of the attack site, but prevented him from providing direct assistance to his injured colleagues or supporting the deterrent efforts being coordinated by Daniel Scott and Peter Tungak. The shed's construction would protect him from bear attack, but its single door and lack of communication equipment made it a potential trap if the bear's behavior pattern changed to include investigation of human structures. Thomas Nakagrok's elevated position in the boom lift had initially provided him with tactical advantages, including superior observation and to coordinate crew movements through radio communications. However, as the attack continued, his position also presented potential liabilities, including the possibility of mechanical failure that could trap him in an elevated position, or damage to the boom lift systems that could make him a target for the bear's aggression. The boom lift's diesel fuel system and hydraulic fluids also represented potential fire hazards if damaged by the bear or by defensive measures deployed by other crew members. The psychological impact of witnessing the extended attack on their colleagues created additional challenges for crew members attempting to implement rescue operations. The sounds of Marcus Rivera's and James Kanguk's screams, combined with the visual trauma of watching a massive predator systematically assault human victims, tested the emotional resilience of even experienced Arctic workers who had previously dealt with life-threatening emergencies. This psychological stress interfered with decision-making abilities and made it difficult to implement complex defensive strategies that required clear thinking and precise timing. The failure of standard pepper spray deterrents to stop or significantly slow Bear Number 347's attack highlighted the limitations of chemical defensive measures against large polar bears, particularly animals that had become habituated to human activity. The bear's apparent tolerance for chemical irritants suggested either previous exposure to such deterrents or physiological characteristics that reduced their effectiveness, possibilities that had important implications for safety protocols used throughout the Arctic region, where human polar bear interactions were becoming increasingly common. Peter Tungak's coordinated use of multiple deterrent measures, including air horns, flares, and chemical sprays, represented the most comprehensive defensive strategy available to the crew. But the bear's continued focus on his victims indicated that even combined deterrents were insufficient to interrupt a committed predatory attack. The failure of these measures to prevent or stop the attack raised serious questions about the adequacy of existing safety protocols for Arctic workers and highlighted the need for more effective defensive strategies when dealing with large predators. Daniel Scott's decision to approach within chemical spray range of the attacking bear demonstrated the kind of personal courage and commitment to crew safety that characterized experienced Arctic supervisors. But it also exposed him to significant personal risk that could have resulted in additional casualties. His approach was tactically sound in terms of maximizing the effectiveness of available deterrent measures, but it also made him vulnerable to secondary attacks if the bear's attention shifted away from his current victims or if multiple bears were present in the area. The extended duration of the attack, estimated at between 6 and 8 minutes from initial contact to the bear's eventual retreat, was significantly longer than typical polar bear encounters with humans and suggested that bear number 347 had categorized the crew members as legitimate prey rather than threats to be avoided. This classification had important implications for understanding the attack and developing improved safety protocols, as predatory attacks required different defensive strategies than encounters involving curious or defensive bears. The crew's radio communications during the attack provided a detailed record of their attempts to coordinate rescue operations and implement defensive measures. But the transmissions also revealed the difficulty of maintaining effective communication under extreme stress. The quality of radio communications deteriorated as crew members' voices became strained by shouting and emotional stress, while the Arctic wind and equipment noise interfered with signal clarity and made it difficult to distinguish between different speakers. James Kanguk's injuries during the bear's secondary attack included severe damage to both legs and his lower torso, injuries that would require immediate surgical intervention to prevent death from hemorrhage and shock. The bear's claws had severed major blood vessels and damaged muscle tissue in ways that would require complex reconstructive procedures, while the crushing force of the animal's bite had broken multiple bones and damaged internal organs. These injuries, combined with exposure to Arctic temperatures through his damaged clothing, created a medical emergency that required immediate helicopter evacuation to advanced trauma facilities. Marcus Rivera's condition continued to deteriorate throughout the extended attack as blood loss and exposure took their toll on his body's ability to maintain core temperature and blood pressure. His initial injuries had included deep lacerations to his arms and shoulders that had severed tendons and damaged nerves, while the bear's weight and claws had caused crushing injuries to his ribs and back that interfered with his breathing and mobility. The combination of these injuries with the Arctic environment created a situation where every minute of delay in medical treatment reduced his chances of survival. The bear's apparent disregard for the increasing volume and intensity of deterrent measures being deployed by the crew demonstrated a level of determination that was unusual even for polar bear attacks. Wildlife experts would later note that bear number 347's persistence in the face of chemical sprays, loud noises, and human activity suggested either previous experience with such deterrents or a level of hunger and desperation that made him willing to accept significant discomfort in order to secure prey. This behavior pattern had important implications for understanding the effectiveness of current safety protocols and the need for alternative defensive strategies. David Akivgak's continued efforts to create distractions and deterrents using available equipment demonstrated the resourcefulness and traditional knowledge that characterized many Alaska Native workers. But the limited effectiveness of these measures highlighted the challenges of dealing with such a large and determined predator using improvised techniques. David's knowledge of traditional polar bear hunting methods provided insights into the animal's behavior and potential vulnerabilities. But the practical application of this knowledge in a defensive situation proved to be extremely difficult, given the bear's size, aggression, and tactical advantages. The worksite's layout and equipment placement had initially provided some tactical advantages for the crew's evacuation efforts, but the bear's intelligence and adaptability allowed him to exploit the same features for his own purposes. The scattered equipment and vehicles created obstacles that slowed human movement while providing concealment opportunities for the bear, while the crew's focus on technical work had created a tactical situation where they were poorly positioned to implement coordinated defensive measures. These factors combined to create a situation where the bear held most of the tactical advantages despite being outnumbered by the human crew. Robert Chen's isolation in the maintenance shed provided him with safety, but also prevented him from contributing to the rescue efforts being coordinated by his colleagues. His position offered clear observation of the attack, but no means of providing direct assistance, creating a psychological burden that would contribute to long-term trauma, even though he was not physically injured during the attack. The shed's single door and lack of communication equipment made it a potentially problematic refuge if the tactical situation changed, or if rescue operations required coordinated action by all available personnel. Thomas Nakagrok's operation of the boom lift throughout the attack provided critical communication and observation capabilities that were essential for coordinating rescue efforts. But his elevated position also made him a potential target if the bear's attention shifted away from ground-based victims. The boom lift's mechanical systems were not designed to withstand attacks by large predators, and damage to hydraulic lines or electrical systems could potentially trap Thomas in an elevated position without means of escape or communication with ground-based rescue personnel. The psychological trauma experienced by crew members who witnessed the extended attack on their colleagues would have lasting effects that extended far beyond the immediate physical injuries sustained by the direct victims. The sounds and visual images of the assault created traumatic memories that would require professional treatment, while the sense of helplessness experienced by crew members who were unable to stop the attack contributed to feelings of guilt and responsibility that complicated the recovery process. These psychological effects would prove to be one of the most challenging aspects of the incident's aftermath, and would require specialized counseling and support services. The failure of multiple deterrent measures to stop or significantly interrupt Bear Number 347's attack challenged fundamental assumptions about polar bear safety protocols and highlighted the need for more effective defensive strategies when dealing with large predators. The bear's apparent tolerance for chemical sprays, loud noises, and human activity suggested that habituation to human presence had reduced the effectiveness of traditional deterrent methods, a finding that had important implications for safety procedures used throughout the Arctic region. Daniel Scott's pepper spray deployment represented the crew's most promising defensive option, but the bear's continued aggression, despite direct chemical contact, indicated that even specialized deterrents were insufficient to stop a committed predatory attack. The spray's effectiveness was further limited by Arctic wind conditions that made precise targeting difficult and potentially redirected some of the chemical agent away from the intended target. These factors combined to demonstrate the limitations of chemical deterrents as primary defensive measures against large polar bears. Peter Tungak's coordinated use of air horns, flares, and other deterrent devices created a comprehensive sensory assault designed to overwhelm the bear's natural threat assessment capabilities. But the animal's persistence indicated a level of determination that was not easily disrupted by external stimuli. The failure of these measures to prevent or interrupt the attack suggested that bear number 347 had made a categorical decision to treat the humans as prey rather than threats, a psychological commitment that was difficult to reverse once established. The extended duration of the attack provided crew members with multiple opportunities to implement rescue strategies. But it also allowed injuries to accumulate and worsen to the point where immediate medical intervention would be required to prevent death. The time factor created a situation where successful deterrent action became increasingly urgent as the victims' conditions deteriorated, adding psychological pressure to rescue attempts and making it more difficult to implement methodical defensive strategies. James Kanguk's injuries included severe damage to major blood vessels in his legs that created life-threatening hemorrhaging, while crushing injuries to his pelvis and lower spine threatened permanent paralysis if not treated immediately by specialized trauma surgeons. The combination of these injuries with exposure to Arctic temperatures created a medical situation that required helicopter evacuation to advanced facilities, but the ongoing bear attack made it impossible to begin emergency medical treatment or prepare the victim for transport. Marcus Rivera's condition had deteriorated to the point where he was losing consciousness due to blood loss and shock, while his damaged winter clothing exposed him to potentially fatal hypothermia from the Arctic environment. His injuries included deep lacerations that had severed tendons in his arms and shoulders, making it impossible for him to assist in his own rescue or defense, while crushing injuries to his torso interfered with his breathing and circulation. The combination of trauma and environmental exposure created a medical emergency that required immediate intervention if he was to survive. The bear's attack pattern demonstrated several characteristics that were consistent with predatory behavior rather than defensive actions, including his focus on disabling specific victims rather than driving away potential threats to his territory. Bear number 347's use of his massive front paws to knock down and disable victims, followed by biting attacks aimed at vital areas, represented hunting techniques that were designed to secure prey rather than eliminate threats. This behavioral pattern indicated that the crew members were being treated as potential food sources rather than competitors or territorial intruders. Wildlife experts would later note that bear number 347's persistence in the face of multiple deterrent measures was unusual even for polar bears, which were known for their intelligence and problem-solving abilities. The bear's apparent disregard for chemical sprays, loud noises, and human activity suggested either previous habituation to these stimuli or a level of hunger and desperation that made him willing to accept significant discomfort in order to secure prey. This behavior pattern raised important questions about the effectiveness of current safety protocols and the need for alternative defensive strategies in areas where polar bears had become habituated to human presence. The crew's scattered positions across the worksite had initially been intended to minimize casualties through dispersal tactics, but the bear's intelligence and tactical awareness allowed him to exploit the same positioning for his own hunting purposes. The distance between crew members made it difficult to coordinate simultaneous deterrent deployments, while the Arctic wind interfered with communication and made it challenging to maintain awareness of the tactical situation. These factors combined to create a situation where the bear was able to focus on individual victims without being overwhelmed by coordinated defensive measures. David Akivgak's improvised deterrent efforts using available tools and equipment demonstrated creative problem-solving under extreme stress, but the limited effectiveness of these measures highlighted the challenges of developing effective countermeasures against such a large and determined predator on short notice. His traditional knowledge of polar bear behavior provided insights into potential vulnerabilities and behavioral patterns But the practical application of this knowledge in a defensive situation proved to be extremely difficult, given the bear's size, aggression, and tactical advantages over human defenders. The worksite's equipment and vehicle placement had created a complex environment that provided both opportunities and obstacles for defensive actions. But the bear's adaptability and intelligence allowed him to navigate this environment effectively while pursuing his selected victims. The scattered tools and materials provided potential improvised weapons and deterrents for human defenders, but they also created obstacles that slowed evacuation efforts and made it difficult to implement coordinated rescue operations. The vehicles that had been intended as safe refuges were positioned too far from the attack site to provide immediate protection, while their construction was not specifically designed to resist attacks by large predators. Robert Chen's position in the maintenance shed provided him with safety and observation capabilities, but it also isolated him from the rescue efforts being coordinated by his colleagues and prevented him from contributing to deterrent deployments or emergency medical assistance. The shed's construction would protect him from bear attack, but its single access point and lack of communication equipment made it a potential trap if the tactical situation changed or if coordinated action by all available personnel became necessary for successful rescue operations. Thomas Nakagrok's continued operation of the boom lift provided essential communication and coordination capabilities that were critical for rescue efforts, but his elevated position also made him vulnerable to attack if the bear's focus shifted away from ground-based victims or if mechanical damage compromised his ability to maintain a safe position. The boom lift's diesel engine and hydraulic systems created noise and activity that might potentially distract the bear, but they also represented potential fire hazards if damaged and could attract the bear's attention if he interpreted the mechanical activity as a threat or challenge. The radio communications maintained throughout the attack provided a detailed record of the crew's desperate attempts to coordinate rescue operations while dealing with the psychological trauma of witnessing their colleagues being systematically mauled by a massive predator. The transmissions revealed the difficulty of maintaining clear communication under extreme stress, as voices became strained and emotional while Arctic wind and equipment noise interfered with signal quality and clarity. Despite these challenges, the radio communications proved essential for coordinating the limited defensive measures available to the scattered crew members. The crew's emergency equipment had been selected and positioned according to established safety protocols for Arctic work sites, but the severity and persistence of Bear Number 347's attack tested these preparations beyond their intended limits. Air horns, pepper spray, and flares had proven insufficient to deter the bear's assault, while first aid supplies remained inaccessible due to the ongoing nature of the attack and the dangerous proximity of the aggressive predator. Emergency communication equipment functioned adequately despite Arctic conditions, but the crew's scattered positions and the stress of the situation made coordinated defensive actions extremely difficult to implement effectively. Peter Tungak's deployment of emergency flares created dramatic lighting effects that improved visibility for crew members attempting to assess the tactical situation and coordinate rescue efforts. But the flares also represented potential fire hazards in an environment containing fuel, hydraulic fluids, and other flammable materials. The visual and auditory stimuli generated by the flares were intended to confuse and deter the bear, but Bear Number 347's continued focus on his victims suggested that even multiple sensory inputs were insufficient to interrupt a committed predatory attack by such a large and determined animal. Daniel Scott's approach to within pepper spray range of the attacking bear represented both the crew's best hope for stopping the assault and their greatest risk of additional casualties if the defensive measure proved ineffective. His tactical decision was based on 20 years of Arctic work experience and multiple training sessions on polar bear safety protocols. But the current situation tested these preparations in ways that no training exercise could fully simulate. The pepper spray deployment would represent a critical moment in the developing crisis, with the potential to either end the attack or escalate it to include additional victims. The injuries sustained by both Marcus Rivera and James Kanguk during the extended attack were severe enough to require immediate helicopter evacuation to advanced trauma facilities, but the ongoing nature of the assault made it impossible to begin emergency medical treatment or prepare the victims for transport. Blood loss from major lacerations and internal injuries was creating life-threatening conditions that would worsen with every minute of delay, while exposure to Arctic temperatures through damaged winter clothing added the additional threat of hypothermia to an already critical medical situation. Bear number 3, 47's behavior during the attack demonstrated several characteristics that were consistent with experienced predatory animals, including tactical awareness of multiple threats in his environment and the ability to prioritize targets based on perceived vulnerability and threat level. The bear's focus on victims who were down and injured, combined with his apparent assessment of deterrent measures as manageable rather than overwhelming threats, suggested cognitive abilities and decision-making processes that were more sophisticated than typically attributed to polar bears in human-wildlife conflict situations. The worksite's isolation from immediate emergency response capabilities meant that the crew would need to resolve the crisis using only their available resources and equipment, a situation that placed enormous pressure on their ability to implement effective defensive measures and provide emergency medical care to injured colleagues. The nearest emergency medical facilities were located in Utqiagvik, approximately 4 miles away, while specialized trauma care would require helicopter evacuation to facilities in Fairbanks or Anchorage, transportation that could take several hours to arrange and implement under the best circumstances. Wildlife tracking data from bear number 347's satellite collar would later reveal that his approach to the worksite had been deliberate and calculated rather than opportunistic, with the bear spending several hours moving toward the airport area and pausing multiple times to observe human activity before committing to the attack. This behavioral pattern suggested that the bear had made a conscious decision to treat the crew members as potential prey, a categorization that explained his persistence in the face of deterrent measures and his apparent disregard for the risks associated with attacking multiple humans in an open environment. The crew's training in polar bear safety protocols had emphasized the importance of group defensive measures and coordinated deterrent deployments, but the practical implementation of these strategies proved to be significantly more challenging than training exercises had suggested. The stress of witnessing colleagues being attacked, combined with the bear's size and aggression, interfered with decision-making abilities and made it difficult to remember and execute complex defensive procedures. Additionally, the crew's scattered positions and the Arctic environment created communication and coordination challenges that had not been fully anticipated during training sessions. David Akivgak's traditional knowledge of polar bear behavior and hunting techniques provided insights that were not available through standard safety training, but the application of this cultural knowledge to defensive situations proved to be extremely difficult given the constraints imposed by modern equipment, worksite layout, and the bear's apparent habituation to human activity. His understanding of polar bear psychology and behavioral patterns suggested potential strategies for disrupting the attack, but implementing these strategies required resources and positioning that were not available given the current tactical situation. The psychological impact on crew members who were forced to witness the extended assault on their colleagues would prove to be one of the most challenging aspects of the incident's aftermath. with several individuals requiring specialized counseling and therapy to deal with traumatic memories and feelings of helplessness. The sounds and visual images of the attack created lasting traumatic associations that would interfere with their ability to return to work in Arctic environments, while survivor guilt complicated the recovery process for those who escaped physical injury during the incident. Robert Chen's isolation in the maintenance shed provided him with relative safety, but also forced him to observe the attack without being able to provide assistance, creating a psychological burden that would contribute to long-term trauma despite his physical safety during the incident. His position offered clear observation of the crisis, but no means of intervention, resulting in detailed memories of his colleagues' suffering combined with feelings of helplessness and guilt over his inability to provide assistance during their time of greatest need. Thomas Nakagrok's elevated position in the boom lift provided him with tactical advantages, including superior observation and communication capabilities, but it also gave him a comprehensive view of the attack that would create lasting traumatic memories. His role as communication coordinator made him an essential part of the rescue effort, but it also required him to maintain operational focus while witnessing the systematic assault on his colleagues, a psychological burden that would require professional treatment in the aftermath of the incident. The extended nature of the attack, lasting approximately 8 to 10 minutes from initial contact to the bear's eventual retreat, provided multiple opportunities for intervention, but also allowed injuries to accumulate and worsen to the point where immediate medical treatment would be essential for survival. The time factor created increasing urgency for successful deterrent action as the victim's conditions deteriorated, adding psychological pressure that interfered with the careful planning and coordination that effective defensive measures required. Wildlife experts analyzing the attack would note that bear number 347's persistence and apparent disregard for multiple deterrent measures suggested that habituation to human activity had significantly reduced the effectiveness of traditional safety protocols, a finding that had important implications for Arctic workers throughout the region. The bear's tolerance for chemical sprays, loud noises, and human activity indicated that previous exposure to these stimuli had diminished their deterrent value, highlighting the need for alternative defensive strategies in areas where polar bears had become accustomed to human presence. The crew's radio communications during the critical phase of the attack provided essential coordination for rescue efforts, while also creating a permanent record of their desperate attempts to save their colleagues from a massive predator. The transmissions revealed both the difficulty of maintaining clear communication under extreme stress and the importance of radio contact for coordinating defensive measures across a scattered group of personnel. Despite interference from Arctic wind and equipment noise, the radio system proved to be the crew's most reliable means of maintaining tactical coordination throughout the crisis. Peter Tungak's experience with previous polar bear encounters had taught him that sustained deterrent pressure was often more effective than single defensive actions, leading him to coordinate the deployment of multiple air horns, flares, and chemical sprays in an attempt to overwhelm bear number 347's sensory processing and force him to retreat from his victims. However, the bear's continued aggression despite these measures indicated that his commitment to the attack was stronger than anticipated, requiring more drastic intervention measures if the assault was to be stopped before additional casualties occurred. Daniel Scott's decision to deploy pepper spray at close range represented the crew's most promising defensive option, but it also exposed him to significant personal risk that could have resulted in additional casualties if the chemical deterrent proved ineffective against such a large and aggressive predator. His approach was tactically sound in terms of maximizing the chemical spray's effectiveness, but it also made him vulnerable to secondary attacks if bear number 347's attention shifted away from his current victims, or if the deterrent action provoked rather than discouraged the bear's aggressive behavior. The failure of standard safety protocols to prevent or quickly resolve the attack highlighted fundamental weaknesses in existing polar bear safety procedures and raised serious questions about the adequacy of current protective measures for Arctic workers. The incident demonstrated that habituation to human activity could significantly reduce the effectiveness of traditional deterrent methods, while the bear's size and determination proved to be greater challenges than safety protocols had anticipated. These findings would have important implications for future safety procedures and equipment recommendations throughout the Arctic region. James Kanguk's injuries included severe damage to both legs and his lower torso that would require immediate surgical intervention to prevent death from blood loss and shock, while crushing damage to bones and internal organs created additional medical complications that would require specialized trauma care. The bear's claws had severed major blood vessels and damaged muscle tissue in ways that would require complex reconstructive procedures, while the force of the animal's bite had broken multiple bones and caused internal injuries that threatened vital organ function. Combined with exposure to Arctic temperatures through his damaged clothing, these injuries created a medical emergency that required helicopter evacuation to advanced trauma facilities. Marcus Rivera's condition continued to deteriorate throughout the extended attack, as blood loss and exposure to Arctic conditions overwhelmed his body's ability to maintain core temperature and blood pressure. His initial injuries had included deep lacerations to his arms and shoulders that had damaged nerves and severed tendons, while crushing injuries to his ribs and back interfered with his breathing and mobility. The combination of these traumatic injuries with the harsh Arctic environment created a situation where every minute of delay in medical treatment significantly reduced his chances of survival, adding urgency to the rescue efforts being coordinated by his colleagues. The bear's attack pattern throughout the extended assault demonstrated hunting behaviors that were designed to disable and secure prey rather than simply drive away territorial threats, indicating that bear number 347 had categorized the crew members as legitimate food sources rather than competitors or intruders in his environment. The bear's use of his massive front paws to knock down and disable victims, followed by biting attacks aimed at vital areas, represented predatory techniques that had evolved for hunting marine mammals but proved to be devastatingly effective when applied to human targets. The crew's emergency medical supplies remained inaccessible throughout the attack due to their storage location near the active assault site, preventing the immediate treatment of traumatic injuries that were rapidly becoming life-threatening for both victims. First aid equipment, including bandages, pressure dressings, and emergency medications, were available but could not be safely retrieved, while bear number 347 continued his aggressive behavior, creating a medical crisis that would require successful deterrent action before emergency treatment could begin. This situation highlighted the importance of positioning emergency medical supplies in locations that would remain accessible even during wildlife encounters. David Akivgak's improvised deterrent efforts using available tools and equipment demonstrated both creative problem-solving abilities and the limitations of improvised defensive measures against such a large and determined predator. His traditional knowledge suggested several potential strategies for disrupting polar bear attacks, but implementing these techniques required resources and positioning that were not available given the current tactical situation and the bear's apparent habituation to human activity and deterrent measures. The worksite's layout had created a complex environment that provided both tactical advantages and disadvantages for human defenders. But bear number 347's intelligence and adaptability allowed him to exploit the terrain and equipment placement for his own purposes while minimizing the effectiveness of human defensive measures. The scattered vehicles and equipment created obstacles that slowed human movement, while providing concealment opportunities for the bear, while the crew's focus on technical work had resulted in positioning that was poorly suited for coordinated defensive actions. Robert Chen's position in the maintenance shed provided him with safety and clear observation of the developing crisis, but it also prevented him from participating in rescue efforts and forced him to witness his colleagues' suffering without being able to provide direct assistance. The shed's reinforced construction offered protection from bear attack, but its single access point created potential problems if the tactical situation required coordinated action by all available personnel, or if the bear's behavior pattern shifted to include investigation of human structures. His isolation in the building also limited his access to radio communications and emergency equipment that might have been useful in supporting rescue operations. Thomas Nakagrok's continued operation of the boom lift throughout the crisis provided essential elevated observation and communication capabilities, but his position also made him increasingly vulnerable as the attack continued, and Bear number 347 demonstrated awareness of multiple threats in his environment. The boom lift's mechanical systems generated noise and movement that might have served as distractions, but they also represented potential points of failure that could trap Thomas in an elevated position if damaged by the bear or by defensive measures deployed by other crew members. The machine's diesel fuel system and hydraulic fluids also created fire hazards that added additional risks to an already dangerous situation. The radio communications maintained by the crew throughout the extended attack provided critical coordination capabilities, while also creating a detailed record of their desperate attempts to implement rescue operations under extreme stress. The transmissions revealed both the psychological impact of witnessing traumatic injuries to colleagues and the difficulty of maintaining tactical awareness while dealing with the emotional trauma of the situation. Despite interference from Arctic wind conditions and equipment noise, the radio system proved to be essential for coordinating the limited defensive measures available to the scattered crew members. Wildlife biologists analyzing Bear number 347 satellite tracking data would later determine that his approach to the work site had been characterized by deliberate movement patterns and extended observation periods that suggested calculated hunting behavior rather than opportunistic investigation of human activity. The bear had spent several hours moving toward the airport area and had paused multiple times to assess the tactical situation before committing to the attack, demonstrating cognitive abilities and decision-making processes that were more sophisticated than typically attributed to polar bears in wildlife management literature. The crew's training in polar bear safety protocols had emphasized group defensive measures and coordinated deterrent deployments, but the practical implementation of these strategies proved to be significantly more challenging than training exercises had anticipated. The stress of witnessing colleagues being attacked interfered with memory and decision-making abilities, while the bear's size and persistence created a level of threat that exceeded the parameters of previous training scenarios. Additionally, the crew's scattered positions and the demands of coordinating rescue efforts made it extremely difficult to implement the systematic defensive procedures that had been practiced during safety training sessions. Peter Tungak's deployment of multiple deterrent measures, including air horns, flares, and chemical sprays, represented the most comprehensive defensive strategy available to the crew, but Bear number 347's continued aggression indicated that even combined deterrent efforts were insufficient to interrupt a committed predatory attack by such a large and determined animal. The failure of these measures to prevent or stop the assault raised fundamental questions about the effectiveness of existing safety protocols and highlighted the need for alternative defensive strategies when dealing with polar bears that had become habituated to human presence and activity. Daniel Scott's approach to within pepper spray range of the attacking bear represented both the crew's best hope for ending the assault and their greatest risk of sustaining additional casualties if the chemical deterrent proved ineffective. His tactical decision was based on extensive Arctic work experience and multiple training sessions, but the current situation tested these preparations in ways that no simulation could fully replicate. The pepper spray deployment would represent a critical moment that could either successfully interrupt the attack or potentially escalate the violence to include additional victims if the bear interpreted the chemical assault as an increased threat requiring more aggressive response. The injuries sustained by Marcus Rivera and James Kanguk during the extended attack were approaching life-threatening severity as blood loss and exposure to Arctic conditions overwhelmed their body's ability to maintain vital functions. Marcus's deep lacerations had severed major blood vessels and tendons, while crushing injuries to his torso interfered with breathing and circulation. James's injuries included severe damage to both legs and his pelvis that had created massive hemorrhaging, while internal injuries from the bear's crushing bite threatened vital organ function. Both victims required immediate medical intervention that could not be provided while the attack continued, creating a medical crisis that added urgency to the rescue efforts being coordinated by their colleagues. Bear number 3, 47's behavior during the extended assault demonstrated several characteristics that distinguished this encounter from typical defensive bear interactions, including persistence in the face of multiple deterrent measures and apparent categorization of humans as legitimate prey rather than territorial threats. The bear's use of hunting techniques that had evolved for securing marine mammals applied to human targets resulted in injury patterns that were far more severe than those associated with defensive encounters. Wildlife experts would later note that this behavioral pattern suggested either unusual individual characteristics or environmental pressures that had modified normal polar bear response patterns to human presence. The work site's isolation from immediate emergency response capabilities meant that the crew would need to resolve the crisis using only their available resources, placing enormous pressure on their ability to implement effective defensive measures and provide emergency medical care. The nearest emergency medical facilities were located in Utqiagvik, approximately 4 miles away, while specialized trauma care would require helicopter evacuation to major medical centers that could be several hours away, even under optimal weather conditions. This isolation factor made successful deterrent action essential for the survival of the injured crew members. David Akivgak's traditional cultural knowledge of polar bear behavior provided insights that were not available through standard safety training, but applying this knowledge to defensive situations proved extremely difficult given the constraints of modern work environments and the bear's apparent habituation to human activity. His understanding of polar bear psychology suggested potential strategies for disrupting the attack, but implementing these approaches required positioning and resources that were not available under current tactical conditions. The gap between traditional knowledge and practical application highlighted the challenges of integrating cultural expertise with modern safety protocols. The psychological trauma experienced by crew members who witnessed the extended assault would prove to be one of the most enduring consequences of the incident, requiring specialized treatment and support services that were not readily available in the remote Arctic community. The combination of visual and auditory trauma from witnessing colleagues being systematically attacked by a massive predator created lasting psychological damage that would interfere with their ability to return to work and normal life activities. Survivor guilt among those who escaped physical injury added additional complexity to the recovery process and would require professional intervention to address effectively. Robert Chen's forced observation of the attack from his position in the maintenance shed created detailed traumatic memories without the psychological buffer of active participation in rescue efforts, resulting in a particularly challenging form of psychological injury that combined helplessness with comprehensive awareness of his colleagues' suffering. His safety during the incident would later create feelings of guilt and responsibility that complicated his recovery process, despite the rational understanding that his position had prevented him from providing effective assistance during the crisis. Thomas Nakagrok's role as elevated observer and communication coordinator required him to maintain operational focus while witnessing traumatic injuries to his colleagues, creating a psychological burden that combined professional responsibility with personal trauma. His position provided him with the most comprehensive view of the attack, resulting in detailed, traumatic memories that would require extensive professional treatment. The cultural significance of his traditional knowledge about polar bear behavior also created additional psychological pressure as he questioned whether different actions on his part might have prevented or minimized the attack. The extended duration of the attack, approaching 10 minutes from initial contact, provided multiple opportunities for intervention while also allowing injuries to worsen to critical levels that would require immediate medical treatment for survival. The time factor created increasing psychological pressure on crew members attempting rescue operations, as they could observe the deteriorating condition of their colleagues while struggling to implement effective defensive measures. This combination of time pressure and traumatic observation would contribute significantly to the long-term psychological impact of the incident. Wildlife experts analyzing the incident would conclude that bear number 347's persistence and apparent disregard for standard deterrent measures indicated that habituation to human activity had fundamentally altered his behavioral responses, reducing the effectiveness of safety protocols that had been developed based on interactions with bears that retained natural fear responses to human presence. This finding had significant implications for safety procedures throughout the Arctic, suggesting that traditional deterrent methods might be inadequate in areas where polar bears had extensive exposure to human infrastructure and activity. The crew's emergency communication equipment functioned adequately throughout the crisis, despite challenging Arctic conditions, providing essential coordination capabilities for rescue efforts and creating a permanent record of their attempts to save their colleagues. Radio transmissions revealed both the difficulty of maintaining clear communication under extreme stress and the critical importance of reliable communication systems for coordinating defensive measures among scattered personnel. The radio records would later provide valuable information for investigators seeking to understand the sequence of events and the effectiveness of various defensive strategies. Peter Tungak's experience with previous polar bear encounters had taught him that successful deterrent actions often required sustained pressure rather than single defensive measures, leading to his coordination of multiple simultaneous deterrent deployments designed to overwhelm the bear's threat assessment capabilities. However, bear number 347's continued aggression, despite comprehensive deterrent efforts, indicated a level of commitment to the attack that exceeded the parameters of previous encounters, suggesting that this situation required more drastic intervention measures than standard protocols provided. Daniel Scott's pepper spray deployment at close range represented the culmination of the crew's defensive efforts and their last realistic hope for stopping the attack before additional casualties occurred. His approach required him to move within striking distance of a massive predator that had already demonstrated his willingness and ability to inflict devastating injuries on human targets, The effectiveness of the chemical deterrent would depend on factors including wind direction, the bear's previous exposure to such chemicals, and his level of commitment to continuing the attack despite the discomfort of chemical exposure. The failure of multiple deterrent measures to stop or significantly interrupt Bear number 347's assault challenged fundamental assumptions about polar bear safety and highlighted critical gaps in existing protective procedures for Arctic workers. The incident demonstrated that standard safety equipment and protocols were insufficient for dealing with large polar bears that had become habituated to human presence, particularly animals that had apparently categorized humans as potential prey rather than threats to be avoided. These findings would require comprehensive review and revision of safety procedures used throughout the Arctic region. James Kanguk's medical condition had deteriorated to critical levels as massive blood loss from severed vessels in his legs created hypovolemic shock, while crushing injuries to his pelvis and internal organs threatened vital functions that would require immediate surgical intervention to preserve. The combination of traumatic injuries with exposure to Arctic temperatures through his damaged winter clothing created a complex medical emergency that would challenge even advanced trauma care capabilities. Every minute of delay in beginning medical treatment significantly reduced his chances of survival and increased the likelihood of permanent disabilities if he did survive the initial trauma. Marcus Rivera's consciousness was fading as blood loss and shock overwhelmed his body's compensatory mechanisms, while his damaged winter clothing exposed him to potentially fatal hypothermia from the Arctic environment. His injuries included nerve damage in his arms and shoulders that would require specialized reconstructive surgery, while crushing injuries to his torso had damaged ribs and potentially internal organs in ways that interfered with his breathing and circulation. The medical crisis created by his condition required immediate helicopter evacuation to advanced trauma facilities, but such evacuation could not begin while the bear attack continued. Bear number 347's attack pattern throughout the extended assault had demonstrated hunting behaviors designed to disable and secure prey rather than eliminate territorial threats, confirming that he had categorized the crew members as food sources rather than competitors in his environment. The bear's systematic focus on vital areas and his persistence, despite injury to himself from defensive measures, indicated predatory commitment that was unlikely to be interrupted by standard deterrent actions. This behavioral classification explained his disregard for chemical sprays, loud noises, and other stimuli that might deter a defensive or curious bear. The crew's emergency medical supplies remained inaccessible due to their proximity to the active attack site, preventing immediate treatment of injuries that were rapidly becoming fatal without intervention. First aid equipment including pressure bandages, emergency medications, and trauma supplies were available, but could not be safely retrieved, while bear number 347 continued his aggressive behavior in the immediate area. This accessibility problem highlighted critical flaws in emergency supply positioning and raised questions about optimal placement strategies for medical equipment in wildlife encounter scenarios. David Akivgak's improvised deterrent efforts using available tools and materials demonstrated creative adaptation to extreme circumstances, but the limited effectiveness of these measures confirmed the challenges of developing successful countermeasures against such a large and determined predator using only resources available at a typical work site. His traditional knowledge suggested several theoretical approaches to disrupting polar bear attacks, but practical implementation proved nearly impossible given the bear's size, the tactical situation, and the apparent habituation that had reduced his fear responses to human activity. The work site's equipment and vehicle placement had created a complex tactical environment that provided both opportunities and obstacles for defensive operations. But Bear Number 347's intelligence and adaptability allowed him to exploit these features for his own hunting purposes while minimizing human advantages. The scattered layout that had been designed for operational efficiency proved to be poorly suited for coordinated emergency response, while vehicles that were intended as refugee points were positioned too far from the work area to provide immediate protection during a rapid attack sequence. Robert Chen's continued observation from the maintenance shed provided him with a comprehensive view of the crisis that would create lasting traumatic memories, while his inability to participate in rescue efforts generated feelings of helplessness and guilt that would complicate his psychological recovery. The shed's construction offered excellent protection from bear attack, but its isolation from communication systems and emergency equipment prevented him from contributing to rescue operations or providing support to his colleagues during their time of greatest need. Thomas Nakagrok's operation of the boom lift throughout the extended crisis provided essential observation and communication capabilities that were critical for coordinating rescue efforts. But his elevated position also exposed him to comprehensive visual trauma that would require extensive professional treatment. His role as primary communications coordinator forced him to maintain operational focus while witnessing systematic assault on his colleagues, creating a psychological burden that combined professional responsibility with personal trauma in ways that would prove extremely difficult to process and resolve. The radio communications maintained throughout the attack created a permanent audio record of the crew's desperate attempts to coordinate rescue operations while dealing with the psychological trauma of witnessing their colleagues being mauled by a massive predator. The transmissions revealed the progressive deterioration of communication quality as stress affected voice control and decision-making abilities, while Arctic wind conditions and equipment noise created additional challenges for maintaining clear tactical coordination among scattered personnel. Wildlife tracking data from Bear Number 347's satellite collar provided detailed information about his approach to the work site that confirmed the deliberate and calculated nature of his hunting behavior rather than opportunistic investigation of human activity. The bear had demonstrated sophisticated tactical awareness by approaching from downwind and using terrain features for concealment, while his extended observation periods suggested careful assessment of the tactical situation before committing to attack. This level of predatory intelligence challenged assumptions about polar bear cognitive abilities and had important implications for developing effective defensive strategies. The crew's training in polar bear safety protocols had emphasized theoretical knowledge and simulated scenarios, but the practical implementation of defensive measures under extreme stress proved to be significantly more challenging than anticipated. The psychological impact of witnessing traumatic injuries to colleagues interfered with memory recall and decision-making processes, while the bear's size and aggression created threat levels that exceeded the parameters of training exercises. The gap between training scenarios and actual crisis conditions highlighted the need for more realistic preparation programs that better simulated the stress and complexity of actual wildlife encounters. Peter Tungak's comprehensive deployment of available deterrent measures represented the most sophisticated defensive strategy possible given the crew's equipment and positioning, but Bear Number 347's continued aggression demonstrated that even coordinated deterrent efforts were insufficient against a polar bear that had committed to a predatory attack. The failure of air horns, flares, and chemical sprays to interrupt the assault indicated that the bear's tolerance for discomfort exceeded the deterrent capability of standard safety equipment, suggesting the need for more effective defensive tools and strategies. Daniel Scott's final approach with pepper spray represented the crew's last realistic option for stopping the attack before additional casualties occurred, but it also exposed him to extreme personal risk that could have resulted in multiple fatalities if the chemical deterrent proved ineffective against such a large and aggressive predator. His decision was based on 20 years of Arctic work experience, but the current situation tested his training and judgment in ways that no previous encounter had required. The pepper spray deployment would determine whether the crew could successfully defend themselves or whether the attack would continue to escalate with potentially catastrophic results. At 12:02 a.m. on July 1st, 2025, Daniel Scott's pepper spray deployment finally achieved the breakthrough that the crew desperately needed to save their colleagues' lives. The concentrated chemical stream struck bear number 347 directly in the face and eyes at a range of approximately 8 feet, creating the first deterrent effect that actually interrupted his assault on James Kanguk and caused him to rear back in obvious discomfort and confusion. The bear's reaction was immediate and dramatic, with violent head shaking and pawing at his eyes, indicating that the chemical irritant had penetrated his natural defenses and created sufficient discomfort to override his predatory focus on the human victims. However, the pepper spray's effect, while significant, was not immediately decisive in ending the attack. Bear number 347's initial reaction lasted approximately 30 seconds, during which time he remained in close proximity to both injured crew members while attempting to clear the chemical irritant from his eyes and nasal passages. His behavior during this period was erratic and potentially more dangerous than his previous focused assault, as his compromised vision and chemical irritation created unpredictable movement patterns that brought him into contact with equipment and obstacles around the work site. Thomas Nakagrok, observing from his elevated position in the boom lift, coordinated the crew's response to the pepper spray deployment by directing additional deterrent measures designed to capitalize on the bear's momentary disorientation. His radio communications guided Peter Tungak and David Akivgak in timing additional air horn blasts and flare deployments to create maximum sensory overload while the bear was already dealing with chemical irritation. A strategy that proved to be more effective than individual deterrent measures had been earlier in the crisis. The coordinated deterrent assault finally succeeded in breaking bear number 347's commitment to the attack, as the combination of chemical irritation, loud noises, and visual stimuli overwhelmed his threat assessment capabilities and triggered a retreat response. The bear began moving away from the worksite at approximately 12:04 a.m., initially in an erratic pattern that suggested continued disorientation from the pepper spray, but gradually settling into a more purposeful retreat toward the northwest that would take him away from both the airport and the nearby community of Utqiagvik. Daniel Scott's successful deployment of the pepper spray had required him to approach within striking distance of an actively attacking polar bear, an action that violated standard safety protocols but proved to be essential for stopping the assault before additional casualties occurred. His courage and tactical judgment under extreme pressure had saved the lives of his colleagues, but the close-range deployment had also exposed him to significant risk and had created additional traumatic memories that would require professional treatment to process effectively. The bear's retreat provided the crew with their first opportunity to assess the extent of injuries sustained by Marcus Rivera and James Kanguk, and to begin emergency medical treatment that had been impossible during the extended attack. Both victims were unconscious and showing signs of severe blood loss and shock, while their damaged winter clothing had exposed them to Arctic temperatures that added hypothermia to their already critical medical conditions. The crew's first priority was to control bleeding and prevent further heat loss while preparing for emergency evacuation, that would require helicopter transport to advanced trauma facilities. Marcus Rivera's injuries were immediately assessed as life-threatening, with deep lacerations to his arms and shoulders that had severed major blood vessels and created massive hemorrhaging. The bear's claws had also caused crushing injuries to his ribs and back that interfered with his breathing and suggested possible internal organ damage that would require surgical exploration and repair. His winter clothing had been shredded by the attack, exposing him to Arctic temperatures that had already begun to lower his core body temperature to dangerous levels. James Kanguk's condition was equally critical, with severe damage to both legs, including compound fractures and arterial bleeding that had created hypovolemic shock. The bear's bite had caused crushing injuries to his pelvis and lower spine that threatened permanent paralysis if not treated immediately by specialized neurosurgeons, while internal injuries suggested damage to organs that could prove fatal without immediate surgical intervention. Like Marcus, his damaged clothing had exposed him to hypothermia that complicated his already desperate medical situation. Peter Tungak and David Akivgak immediately began implementing emergency medical procedures using the first aid supplies that had become accessible with the bear's retreat, focusing on pressure bandages and direct pressure to control bleeding, while Daniel Scott coordinated radio communications to request emergency helicopter evacuation. The crew's emergency medical training proved essential during these critical minutes, as proper application of first aid techniques would determine whether their colleagues survived long enough to reach advanced trauma care facilities. Robert Chen emerged from the maintenance shed to assist with emergency medical care, bringing additional first aid supplies and helping to coordinate the complex logistics of preparing two critical patients for helicopter evacuation in Arctic conditions. His technical background proved valuable for problem-solving challenges related to emergency equipment and communication systems, while his emotional stability helped maintain focus on medical priorities despite the traumatic nature of the situation. Thomas Nakagrok used the boom lift to maintain elevated surveillance for any indication that bear number 347 might return to the area, while also coordinating radio communications with airport control tower personnel and emergency response agencies in Utqiagvik. His elevated position provided optimal observation capabilities and radio reception, making him the crew's primary communication link with outside emergency services during the critical period when medical evacuation arrangements were being coordinated. The crew's radio communications with emergency services revealed the complexity of coordinating helicopter evacuation from the remote Arctic location, particularly given the critical nature of the victim's injuries and the specialized medical equipment that would be required during transport. The nearest helicopter equipped for medical evacuation was based in Fairbanks, requiring approximately 90 minutes of flight time to reach Utqiagvik under optimal weather conditions, while the victim's conditions suggested that they might not survive such a delay without immediate medical intervention. Emergency medical services in Utqiagvik were limited to basic life support capabilities that were insufficient for treating the severe trauma and blood loss experienced by both victims, making helicopter evacuation to advanced trauma centers essential for their survival. However, the logistics of Arctic medical evacuation were complicated by weather conditions, specialized equipment requirements, and the need for medical personnel trained in wilderness trauma care to accompany the patients during transport to major medical facilities. Daniel Scott's coordination of emergency response efforts demonstrated the leadership and crisis management skills that had made him an effective Arctic supervisor, as he balanced immediate medical care priorities with the complex logistics of evacuation planning while maintaining security protocols in case bear number 347 returned to the area. His experience with previous Arctic emergencies proved invaluable for understanding the resources and timeframes involved in remote area rescue operations. The crew's emergency medical equipment included supplies for treating severe trauma, but the extent of injuries sustained by both victims exceeded the capability of field-level first aid and required immediate access to surgical facilities and blood transfusion capabilities that were only available at major medical centers. The first aid measures implemented by the crew were essential for stabilizing the victims during the initial critical period, but long-term survival would depend on successful helicopter evacuation and rapid transport to specialized trauma care. Marcus Rivera's consciousness fluctuated during the initial medical assessment, with periods of awareness alternating with unconsciousness that indicated severe blood loss and possible traumatic brain injury from impact with the frozen ground during the attack. His breathing was labored and irregular, suggesting possible chest injuries that could include pneumothorax or other conditions requiring immediate surgical intervention. The medical team's priority was to maintain his airway and circulation while controlling bleeding from multiple lacerations. James Kanguk remained unconscious throughout the initial medical assessment, with vital signs indicating severe shock and possible internal bleeding that could prove fatal without immediate surgical exploration. His leg injuries included arterial damage that required constant pressure to control bleeding, while the crushing nature of his pelvic injuries suggested internal organ damage that could only be assessed and treated in a hospital environment with advanced diagnostic capabilities. The psychological impact on crew members providing emergency medical care was significant, as they were forced to deal with the traumatic injuries of close colleagues while maintaining the technical focus required for effective first aid implementation. The combination of personal emotional trauma with professional medical responsibilities created stress levels that tested their ability to maintain effective performance during the critical period when their colleagues' lives depended on proper emergency care. Bear Number 3, 47's retreat from the worksite, provided temporary security for the medical response efforts, but wildlife experts would later note that polar bears sometimes returned to investigate areas where they had encountered food sources, making continued vigilance essential throughout the evacuation process. The crew maintained watch for any indication of the bears' return, while focusing primary attention on medical care and evacuation coordination, a division of attention that highlighted the continuing security challenges presented by the remote Arctic location. The worksite's isolation from emergency medical services created additional challenges for coordinating helicopter evacuation, as the logistics of Arctic medical transport required coordination between multiple agencies and specialized equipment that was not routinely available in the remote northern region. Weather conditions, which had been favorable during the attack, remained stable enough to permit helicopter operations, but Arctic weather could change rapidly and create additional delays or complications for evacuation efforts. David Akivgak's traditional knowledge of emergency medical techniques proved valuable for supplementing the crew's first aid training, particularly regarding methods for maintaining body temperature and circulation in Arctic conditions. His cultural background provided insights into survival techniques that had been developed over generations of living in harsh Arctic environments, knowledge that complemented modern emergency medical procedures and proved essential for stabilizing the victims during the extended period required for evacuation coordination. The crew's emergency communication equipment functioned effectively for coordinating with outside agencies despite challenging Arctic conditions, providing reliable contact with emergency medical services, aircraft control, and wildlife management authorities who would be involved in the response to the incident. Radio communications proved essential for providing medical information to evacuation personnel and ensuring that appropriate medical equipment and personnel would be available during transport to trauma facilities. Peter Tungak's experience with previous Arctic emergencies provided valuable insights into the realistic timeframes and resource requirements for helicopter evacuation from the remote location, helping to establish priorities for immediate medical care while evacuation arrangements were being coordinated. His practical knowledge of Arctic logistics proved essential for understanding what could realistically be accomplished with available resources and what would require outside assistance or specialized equipment. Robert Chen's technical background proved valuable for troubleshooting communication equipment and coordinating the complex logistics of emergency response, while his emotional stability during the crisis helped maintain focus on essential priorities despite the traumatic nature of the situation. His contributions demonstrated the importance of having personnel with diverse skills and backgrounds available during emergency situations, as technical problems and coordination challenges often arose unexpectedly during crisis response operations. Thomas Nakagrok's elevated position in the boom lift provided optimal visibility for monitoring both the victim's conditions and the surrounding area for any indication of bear number 347's return, while his radio communications served as the primary coordination link between crew members implementing medical care and outside agencies arranging evacuation support. His role as communication coordinator proved essential for maintaining tactical awareness and ensuring that medical information was accurately transmitted to incoming emergency personnel. The emergency medical assessment revealed that both victims had sustained injuries that were beyond the treatment capabilities available at Utqiagvik's basic medical facilities, making helicopter evacuation to advanced trauma centers essential for their survival. The nearest facilities capable of treating severe trauma were located in Fairbanks and Anchorage, requiring flight times that would test the victims to survive their injuries even with optimal emergency medical care during transport. Marcus Rivera's medical condition stabilized somewhat with the application of pressure bandages and direct pressure to control bleeding, but his continued unconsciousness and irregular breathing patterns indicated serious injuries that would require immediate surgical intervention upon arrival at a trauma center. His core body temperature had dropped significantly due to exposure through his damaged winter clothing, adding hypothermia to his already critical medical situation and requiring active warming measures during transport. James Kanguk's condition remained critical despite emergency medical intervention, with continued bleeding from arterial damage in his legs and signs of internal injuries that could prove fatal without immediate surgical exploration. His unconscious state prevented assessment of potential spinal cord damage from the crushing injuries to his pelvis and lower back, while his dropping blood pressure indicated severe shock that would require blood transfusion and aggressive medical intervention to reverse. The crew's coordination of emergency medical care demonstrated both the value of first aid training and the limitations of field-level medical intervention when dealing with severe trauma in remote locations. Their actions during the critical period following the attack were essential for stabilizing the victims and preparing them for evacuation. But the severity of injuries sustained during the bear attack would require the full resources of major trauma centers to address effectively. At 12:28 a.m. on July 1st, 2025, the first emergency helicopter arrived at Utqiagvik Airport, carrying advanced life support equipment and medical personnel trained in wilderness trauma care. The helicopter crew included a flight nurse and paramedic who immediately began advanced medical assessment and treatment of both victims while coordinating preparations for transport to Providence, Alaska Medical Center in Anchorage. the nearest facility equipped with the specialized trauma surgery capabilities required for their injuries. The medical assessment conducted by the helicopter crew confirmed the severity of both victims' conditions and the critical nature of their injuries, while also revealing additional complications, including possible internal bleeding and signs of severe shock that would require immediate surgical intervention upon arrival at the trauma center. The medical team's priority was to stabilize both patients for transport while maintaining their vital functions during the extended flight time required to reach advanced medical facilities. Marcus Rivera was loaded into the helicopter first, with medical personnel maintaining pressure on bleeding wounds while administering IV fluids and oxygen to support his circulation and breathing. His condition remained critical but stable enough for transport, though his continued unconsciousness and irregular vital signs indicated that his survival would depend on immediate surgical intervention upon arrival at the trauma center. The medical team's assessment suggested multiple internal injuries that could only be fully evaluated and treated in a hospital environment. James Kanguk's condition was assessed as even more critical, with signs of massive internal bleeding and shock that threatened his survival even with advanced medical support during transport. His leg injuries had been temporarily stabilized with pressure bandages and splints, but the arterial damage required surgical repair that could only be performed in an operating room with specialized equipment and surgical teams. The medical assessment also suggested possible spinal cord damage from crushing injuries that could result in permanent paralysis if not treated immediately. The helicopter evacuation represented the beginning of a complex medical journey that would require multiple surgical procedures and months of rehabilitation for both victims, assuming they survived the initial trauma and transport to advanced medical facilities. The crew members who remained at the work site watched as their colleagues were loaded into the helicopter, knowing that they might never see them alive again, and struggling with feelings of guilt and helplessness that would require professional counseling to address effectively. Bear number 3. 47's satellite tracking collar continued to transmit location data throughout the incident and its aftermath, providing wildlife biologists with detailed information about his movements following the attack. The tracking data revealed that the bear had moved approximately 2 miles from the work site before stopping in an area that provided natural shelter and concealment, behavior that suggested he was experiencing continued effects from the pepper spray deployment and needed time to recover from the chemical irritation. The work site remained active with emergency response personnel and investigators who arrived to document the attack and assess the security situation for ongoing airport operations. Wildlife management authorities coordinated with Alaska State Troopers to track bear number 347's movements and determine whether he posed continued threats to the airport or the nearby community, while also beginning the complex process of deciding whether the bear should be relocated or destroyed as a public safety measure. Daniel Scott's leadership during the crisis had saved the lives of his colleagues, but the psychological impact of the attack and his decision to approach an actively attacking polar bear would require extensive counseling and support to process effectively. His actions had been heroic and necessary, but they had also exposed him to traumatic experiences that would affect his ability to continue working in Arctic environments without professional intervention and support. The crew members who had witnessed the extended attack would all require psychological counseling and trauma treatment to deal with the lasting effects of observing their colleagues being systematically mauled by a massive predator. The combination of visual and auditory trauma, combined with feelings of helplessness and survivor guilt, created psychological injuries that would prove to be as challenging to treat as the physical injuries sustained by the direct victims of the attack. Thomas Nakagrok's role as primary observer and communication coordinator had provided him with the most comprehensive view of the attack, creating detailed traumatic memories that would require specialized treatment to process and integrate. His traditional cultural knowledge had provided valuable insights during the crisis, but it had also created additional psychological pressure as he questioned whether different actions might have prevented or minimized the attack. The intersection of traditional knowledge and modern trauma would require culturally sensitive counseling approaches to address effectively. Peter Tungak's experience with previous bear encounters had prepared him for some aspects of the crisis, but the severity and duration of the current attack exceeded anything in his previous experience and created traumatic memories that would require professional treatment. His coordination of deterrent measures had been essential for supporting the successful rescue effort, but his comprehensive observation of the assault had also created lasting psychological trauma that would affect his ability to continue working in polar bear habitat. David Akivgak's improvised deterrent efforts had demonstrated both creativity and traditional knowledge. But the limited effectiveness of these measures had created feelings of inadequacy and guilt that would complicate his psychological recovery. His position as the youngest crew member also made him particularly vulnerable to long-term psychological effects, as his developing sense of professional competence had been challenged by the traumatic experience of witnessing colleagues being severely injured despite his efforts to help. Robert Chen's isolation in the maintenance shed had protected him from physical injury, but had forced him to observe the attack without being able to provide assistance, creating a particularly challenging form of psychological trauma that combined safety with helplessness. His technical background had proven valuable during the emergency response, but his inability to intervene during the actual attack had created guilt and trauma that would require specialized counseling to address effectively. The airport operations were suspended indefinitely while investigators documented the attack scene, and wildlife management authorities assessed the ongoing security threat posed by bear number 347 and other polar bears in the area. The incident highlighted fundamental vulnerabilities in airport security protocols and raised serious questions about the adequacy of existing safety measures for protecting workers and passengers in Arctic aviation facilities where polar bear encounters were becoming increasingly common. Wildlife biologists analyzing the incident would conclude that bear number 347's behavior represented a significant departure from typical polar bear interactions with humans, suggesting either individual behavioral abnormalities or environmental pressures that had modified normal response patterns to human presence. The bear's persistence in the face of multiple deterrent measures and his apparent categorization of humans as prey rather than threats had important implications for safety protocols throughout the Arctic region. The crew's emergency response had demonstrated both the value of proper training and the limitations of standard safety equipment when dealing with large predators that had become habituated to human activity. The incident would lead to comprehensive reviews of safety protocols and equipment recommendations for Arctic workers, while also highlighting the need for more effective defensive measures and improved emergency response capabilities in remote locations. The successful pepper spray deployment that had ended the attack provided valuable information about effective deterrent strategies, but it also highlighted the extreme personal risk required to deploy chemical deterrents at close range against actively attacking polar bears. The incident demonstrated that even effective deterrent measures required courage and tactical skill that exceeded standard safety training, raising questions about realistic expectations for defensive actions by Arctic workers. The helicopter evacuation of both victims represented the beginning of a long and uncertain recovery process that would require multiple surgical procedures, extensive rehabilitation, and psychological counseling to address the trauma of the attack. Marcus Rivera and James Kanguk faced months or years of medical treatment and recovery, with uncertain prospects for returning to normal life activities or Arctic work environments. The incident's impact extended beyond the immediate victims to include their families, the broader Utqiagvik community, and Arctic workers throughout the region who would need to reassess their own safety procedures and risk management strategies. The attack represented one of the most serious polar bear incidents in recent memory and would influence safety policies and procedures for years to come. Bear number 3, 47's tracking data would continue to provide valuable information about his post-attack behavior and movement patterns, helping wildlife biologists understand the long-term effects of the encounter on his behavioral patterns and assess the ongoing risk he might pose to human safety. The decision about whether to relocate or destroy the bear would require careful consideration of public safety priorities, balanced against wildlife conservation concerns and the complex factors that had contributed to the attack. The crew members who remained at Utqiagvik Airport faced an uncertain future as they dealt with the psychological trauma of the attack while participating in the investigation and documentation process required to understand what had happened and prevent similar incidents. Their experiences would provide valuable insights for improving safety protocols and training programs, but the personal cost of gaining this knowledge would affect their lives for years to come. The incident occurred during a time of increasing human polar bear conflicts throughout the Arctic region, as climate change and habitat modification brought these powerful predators into more frequent contact with human infrastructure and activities. The attack at Utqiagvik Airport represented a dramatic escalation in the severity of these encounters and highlighted the urgent need for improved safety measures and response capabilities to protect human life while maintaining essential Arctic operations. At 1:15 a.m. on July 1st, 2025, as the medical helicopter disappeared into the Arctic sky, carrying Marcus Rivera and James Kanguk toward uncertain futures, the remaining crew members at Utqiagvik Airport faced the sobering reality that their lives had been permanently changed by 8 minutes of violence that had tested every assumption about safety and survival in one of the world's most unforgiving environments. The attack by bear number 347 had ended, but its consequences would ripple through their lives, their community, and Arctic safety protocols for years to come, serving as a stark reminder of the delicate balance between human ambition and natural forces in the rapidly changing Arctic landscape. The immediate aftermath of the attack revealed the complex web of emergency response, investigation, and recovery procedures that would be required to address both the human trauma and the broader safety implications of the incident. Alaska state troopers, wildlife biologists, federal aviation officials, and emergency medical personnel converged on Utqiagvik to begin the comprehensive documentation and analysis process that would be essential for understanding what had happened and preventing similar tragedies in the future. Wildlife management authorities faced the difficult decision of determining bear number 347's fate, as his demonstrated willingness to attack humans and apparent categorization of people as prey made him an ongoing public safety threat that could not be ignored. The bear's satellite collar continued to transmit location data showing his movement away from the airport area, but his proximity to the community and his proven dangerous behavior created an urgent need for decisive action to protect public safety. The crew members who had survived the attack without physical injury faced their own challenging recovery process, as the psychological trauma of witnessing their colleagues being systematically mauled by a massive predator would require extensive professional counseling and support to process effectively. The combination of survivor guilt, traumatic memories, and uncertainty about their colleagues' survival created emotional burdens that would test their resilience and require specialized treatment to address. Daniel Scott's heroic actions during the crisis had saved lives, but they had also exposed him to extreme psychological trauma that would require careful management to prevent long-term mental health complications. His decision to approach within striking distance of an actively attacking polar bear had been tactically necessary and personally courageous. But it had also created traumatic memories that would need professional intervention to process and integrate into his psychological recovery. The broader implications of the attack extended far beyond the immediate victims to encompass Arctic aviation safety, polar bear management policies, and the fundamental question of how human activities could be safely maintained in environments where increasingly desperate wildlife posed growing threats to human safety. The incident would influence policy decisions and safety protocols throughout the Arctic region, while also highlighting the urgent need for better understanding of how climate change was affecting wildlife behavior patterns. The crew's experiences during the attack provided valuable insights into the effectiveness of various safety measures and defensive strategies. But this knowledge had been gained at enormous personal cost that would affect their lives for years to come. Their courage and professionalism during the crisis had prevented additional casualties and had contributed to the survival of their injured colleagues. But the price of this heroism would be measured in lasting psychological trauma and fundamental changes to their sense of safety and security in Arctic work environments. The incident at Utqiagvik Airport on June 30th, 2025, would be remembered as a watershed moment in Arctic safety history, marking the point where theoretical discussions about polar bear threats became practical reality with devastating consequences for human life and well-being. The attack by bear number 347 had demonstrated that existing safety protocols were inadequate for protecting workers against large predators that had become habituated to human presence, while also highlighting the courage and professionalism of Arctic workers who risked their own lives to save their colleagues. As the sun continued its lazy arc across the Arctic sky on the morning of July 1st, 2025, the empty worksite at Utqiagvik Airport stood as silent testimony to the violence that had shattered the lives of 7 men and their families. The approach lights that had been the focus of their professional attention remained unfinished, their installation halted by an encounter with one of nature's most formidable predators that had reminded everyone involved of the fundamental truth that in the Arctic, human survival depended on respect for the power and unpredictability of the natural world. The scattered equipment and blood-stained snow would soon be cleaned up and removed, but the memories of what had happened on that remote Arctic worksite would remain with the survivors for the rest of their lives, serving as a permanent reminder of the courage, sacrifice, and human cost involved in maintaining critical infrastructure in one of the world's most challenging and dangerous environments. The attack had ended, but its legacy would continue to influence Arctic safety practices and remind future generations of workers about the very real dangers that existed alongside the essential work of supporting human life and activities in the far north. Bear number 347 satellite collar would continue transmitting for several more weeks, providing wildlife biologists with detailed tracking data that would help them understand his post-attack behavior and movement patterns. The bear would eventually be located and destroyed by wildlife management authorities, who determined that his demonstrated willingness to attack humans made him an unacceptable public safety risk. But his actions on June 30th, 2025, had already permanently altered the lives of 7 men and raised fundamental questions about the future of human activities in an Arctic environment, where climate change was forcing increasingly desperate wildlife into closer contact with human infrastructure and communities. The investigation into the attack would continue for months, generating hundreds of pages of reports and recommendations that would influence Arctic safety policies for years to come. The courage and professionalism demonstrated by the crew during the crisis would be recognized and honored. But no amount of recognition could undo the physical and psychological trauma that had been inflicted during 8 minutes of violence that had tested every assumption about safety and survival in the modern Arctic. As emergency responders, investigators, and wildlife management personnel worked to address the immediate aftermath of the attack, the 2 critically injured crew members began their long journey toward recovery and trauma centers hundreds of miles away. Marcus Rivera and James Kanguk faced uncertain futures filled with multiple surgeries, extensive rehabilitation, and the psychological challenge of integrating their traumatic experiences into their ongoing lives, while their families struggled to cope with the sudden transformation of routine work assignments into life-threatening medical emergencies. The incident at Utqiagvik Airport would eventually be recognized as one of the most significant polar bear attacks in modern Arctic history, not only because of the severity of injuries inflicted, but also because of the insights it provided into changing wildlife behavior patterns and the limitations of existing safety protocols. The attack by bear number 347 had demonstrated that the traditional boundaries between human and wildlife territories were breaking down in ways that required fundamental reassessment of how people could safely live and work in Arctic environments. The crew members who had experienced the attack would eventually return to their families and communities, but they would carry with them lasting changes that reflected their encounter with one of nature's most powerful predators during a moment when human civilization's thin veneer of safety and security had been stripped away to reveal the fundamental vulnerability that existed wherever people ventured into wild spaces. Their experiences would serve as both warning and inspiration for future generations of Arctic workers who would need to balance the essential requirements of human infrastructure with the growing challenges posed by a changing Arctic environment. The empty worksite at Utqiagvik Airport would eventually be restored to operation, with new safety protocols and equipment designed to prevent similar incidents, but the memory of what had happened there would remain as a permanent reminder of the courage, sacrifice, and human cost involved in maintaining civilization's foothold in one of the world's most challenging and unforgiving environments. The attack had ended, but its lessons would continue to influence Arctic safety practices and serve as a testament to the bravery of ordinary workers who faced extraordinary dangers in service of their communities and their colleagues.